Good morning. Hello, good morning. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the BFORE final conference here in Brussels. We're absolutely delighted to welcome you all to this event, and especially to our international guests. And thank you also so much for the SEPS team for hosting us today. We have a very exciting program, but it's really packed with a lot of information, sessions, discussions. So I propose that we quickly go ahead. When we submitted this project proposal to the Commission, it was 2020, just at the start of the COVID pandemic, and there was a lot of discussion on inequality at the time, on people losing jobs, temporary unemployment, and so on. At the time, also the minimum wage directive was high on the political agenda, but Sam and colleagues from our team, when we were discussing what should we do, where should we focus on, we also noticed, of course, our own research on collective bargaining and the importance of really lifting all the boats and making sure that inequality is tackled at its root. So that was the inspiration for the project. Today we will dive into what we did, the results. We will also present you a bargaining simulation game, so get ready to start bargaining and help us tackle inequality. But to really kick off this session, we are so delighted and honored to welcome Dr. Andrea Garnero, who is an economist at the OECD, to present on his work. So thank you so much, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for inviting me. So I have a few slides. You are in charge of the slides. So I'm very delighted to be here and honored that you invited me to give some thoughts on collective bargaining today and the role of collective bargaining in Europe and OECD countries. I think it's interesting to note that there's been a remarkable regaining interest in collective bargaining across the world. Of course, not just Europe, you just mentioned the EU directive, but there has been regaining interest elsewhere as well. New Zealand introduced the so-called new framework pay agreements last year. I have to tell you that the new coalition government will most likely scrap them very soon, but it was still an interesting effort to reintroduce sectoral bargaining, forms of sectoral bargaining in a country that did not have any sectoral bargaining in the last 30 years. There are discussions on introducing for the first time sectoral bargaining in Chile and discussions on how to go about in Australia and also partly more limited in the United States. In Europe, there have also been a couple of recent remarkable tripartite agreements in Portugal, Sweden, Spain on inflation and pay, on reforming the labor market, on making transitions easier in a changing world of work. But there's also been a remarkable regaining interest in academia. So here I just copy-pasted the titles of few job market papers of this year. Extreme good papers, top-notch level of research on unions and collective bargaining. And in fact, there is more than that. So I would say that the tide has definitely turned compared to the last couple of decades where collective bargaining was seen as mostly as a relic of the past and something very specific to few European countries. Why is it so? So why did we experience a return in interest in the role of social partners and collective bargaining more in general? I think there are a number of reasons. The first is that in a complex world, and the world has never been easy, but certainly it is not easy today, there has been a realization that we need to mobilize all available tools to govern in a way this world. And therefore realizing that making less of an instrument that still can deliver interesting results was possibly a pity. Because indeed collective bargaining still performs when it works well. Of course, I think I'll say it many times, but of course it doesn't mean that collective bargaining is a silver bullet and always is always good, not at all. But when it works well, collective bargaining can still perform functions that are relevant today in terms of negotiating compromising and managing conflict. So often we are very scared of the word conflict and conflict itself, but conflict exists in our societies, and therefore we have to find ways to channel and use in the best way this conflict. And in fact, I would even dare to say that in order to progress in the larger sense of the term, we need some conflict, in the sense we cannot just be all thinking the same, so we're only going in one direction. In fact, it's through the conflict, peaceful conflict of ideas and exchanges and interests that we grow, and competition, innovation. This is in the end forms of conflicts between companies and so on. So I think we should reevaluate the concept of conflict, acknowledging that there is conflict, and collective bargaining, social dialogue is one way of managing and channeling for the best. The second issue is that over the last 3, 4, 5 years, there has been an increasing realization that the labor market does not work in the one-on-one version of an economic textbook of supply and demand, that there are frictions, that there are imbalances in market power, and therefore having, let's say, ways to rebalance the bargaining power of workers in this case may help the market function better by itself. Not just today you will focus on inequalities, but here is really about more the efficiency side of the market. And third, on, let's say, related somewhat to the topic of inequalities, that we need to maintain the cohesion of our societies. We need tools to ensure that everybody somehow benefits from the spoil of the growth when we have growth, and then we protect vulnerable workers, and collective bargaining can deliver that. Then there are some more specific reasons, I believe, related to the transitions that we are facing in the world of work. The green transition, the digital transition, but also what is happening on the demographic front, as well as, of course, some rebalancing, readjusting in global value chains and globalization. And I think we have concrete examples, this is not just wishful thinking, concrete examples of collective agreements and social dialogue, as I was mentioning before, the tripartite agreement in Sweden, delivering agreements and concrete tools to manage this transition, such as demographic and technological change. And what is a plus of social dialogue and collective bargaining is that it often does that in a more flexible, tailored way than the law. The law is the same for everyone in a country, usually, or in a region, in a state, in a country, whereas collective bargaining can allow some tailoring at firm or sector level. We are seeing this, for instance, these very days with some interesting agreements on shorter working time, which take very different forms, in fact, across companies and sectors, addressing the specificities of this company, so making that sustainable for the company in terms of labor cost, productivity, and output goals, and so on and so forth, and for workers. So in the end, finding pragmatic ways which maybe a national law would not allow. Second, collective bargaining, collective agreements are delivering new rights. Let's say all the debate on the right to disconnection, or strengthening old rights, such as the right to training. For instance, in Italy, a collective agreement introduced the individual right to training. So disconnecting the possibility to train from the company one works in, because usually, let's say, the possibility of training is very much related to what the employer and the company offers. The individual right to train is let's say, the aim, the ambition to give everyone, irrespective of where this person works, the possibility to train. And finally, as the Swedish tripartite agreements show, social partners can complement the efforts and also take some forward steps in strengthening labor market security and adaptability. That being said, it's clear that there are a number of challenges, old and new, that make the functioning of collective bargaining today still challenging in many countries. So the first main and not new challenge is the strength of social partners. So a well-functioning collective bargaining system has to rely on a strong organization of social partners. And we have seen in the last decades a steady and strong decline in trade union density in many OECD countries. On average, it went from 30% to 14%, so less than half in the last 40 years. And you see that the decline is, it's the orange line, is pretty steady. And there was at some point a little bit of hope that there would be a regain, and let's say during COVID, but in fact, at least in the US, it was essentially a composition effect, and so the decline continues to be rather steady. Not everywhere, so up there you have Belgium and other European countries, but you see that even in Europe is not that far from the OECD average. You experience lower but equally steady decline in collective bargaining coverage. So the number of workers covered by collective agreement that went from 44 to 32% over the last 40 years. So less and less workers covered by a collective agreement. On this, Europe is different from the rest of OECD countries. Thanks to, let's say, the presence of sectoral bargaining and thanks to the use of administrative extensions in some countries. So you see that the share in Europe is significantly higher. Still, only 8 EU countries are above the 80% threshold identified by the EU directive. So the remaining 19 countries have a collective bargaining coverage lower than 80%. In some cases, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, is way below the threshold. Interestingly, and I'll come back to that, employers' organizations have proven to be remarkably stable. We have, unfortunately, not as detailed data as for trade union density, and not enough, let's say, a long time series as for trade union density, but you see that more or less between 2000 and today, the share of workers working in companies that are member of an employers organization has remained quite stable. And I'll come back to that. This is a key element of ensuring the stability of sectoral collective bargaining in European countries, or where sectoral collective bargaining is present. So some of these challenges have been there for many decades, but they are amplified, or they may be amplified by recent trends in the labor market, and particularly the development of what sometimes we call, let's say, the non-standard forms of work, but let's say all the forms of work that are not permanent full-time jobs. And so you have very diverse forms of employment, going from, let's say, the so simple temporary or part-time to a temporary work agency to self-employed or bogus self-employment, and so on and so forth. And you see that unionization among these workers, on average, is half of the unionization among permanent full-time workers. So the issues have changed a little bit now after COVID, the strong recovery, inflation, where we see an increasing share of workers hired with permanent contracts. And so let's say that the bargaining power of workers has increased, leading also to an improvement in the types of contracts that are offered. But if we were on the same path before the COVID, before inflation, of increasing share of workers with a contract different from, let's say, the permanent full-time, this certainly would raise concern in terms of further weakening the position of unions, as they are less able to reach out to these workers, or these workers feel less secure to become a member of a trade union, given their somewhat weakened contractual position. So there are some trends, some labor market trends, but there are also issues related to legislation, and an increasing tension, and I think this is a tension that remains, between legislation both in the labor market and in competition rules that see that divides the workers between two very different categories, between employees and self-employed, and a reality of work where there is a gray zone between this opposite pole of employees and self-employed, of people who work in positions that are maybe formally, technically speaking, self-employed, but de facto they resemble very much to employees because they have to show up at work, because they have working time, they have rules on the way they should dress, they should behave, and so on and so forth. So not really the freedom that is usually associated to self-employed work. And unfortunately, our rules, both in the labor market and in competition, are not yet adapted. And every month you see something there. I just put the screenshot of last week or the week before, the ruling of the UK Supreme Court that undid, in fact, many of preceding rulings on delivery riders, saying that they are not workers and therefore they have not the right to collective bargaining, because self-employed workers are companies, and companies bargaining together are a cartel. So against the antitrust regulation in Europe and in national legislation, and therefore bargaining for self-employed is usually not possible. However, we all know that there is an increasing gray zone here. It's all the possibilities that are out there, where in the end access varies on national legislation or the interpretation of courts, as you see in the UK. However, it's remarkable, I think, to note that the EU has made some step forwards on this by issuing last year these guidelines on the access to collective bargaining for self-employed workers, identified some specific categories. So I think it's remarkable that regulators are aware and trying to make some step forward in order to adapt legislation to a world of work that is not binary anymore between employment and self-employment. And finally, the last challenge is the return of one of the main ghosts of the past, that is inflation. This is challenging on many ways. First of all, because we should be aware that there is a generation, my generation and the generation of many people here, but it's also the generation of many people in trade unions, many people in employers' organizations and in companies that have never experienced these levels of inflation, and therefore have no prior experience on how to deal with inflation. And I think we should not underestimate what this means in terms of facing something that seems very new. And then because inflation, of course, severely tests the functioning and the ability of collective bargaining system to deliver good outcomes, in the sense that the collective bargaining systems are called into delivering real wage increases for workers while keeping costs for firms in check, so not completely disrupt the competitiveness of a company, of a sector, of a country. And finally, not igniting the much feared wage price spiral that we have not observed, but still, of course, it doesn't mean that it's theoretically impossible. It's theoretically possible. We have maybe rarely observed it, and we are not observing it right now, but it's not technically impossible. And so basically collective bargaining systems are called into squaring this triangle of delivering real wage increasing, keeping the competitiveness and the cost in check, and not igniting a wage price spiral. And it's challenging. So we see, you can see the gap that has created. So this is the gap that has to be filled. And on average, of course, there are some exceptions here. You have Belgium, the Netherlands, but there are, on average, across the EU area in the second quarter of 2023, the negotiated wage increases were still below inflation. And so all the challenge in the coming quarters and months will be to fill this gap while, as I said, and maybe even, let's say, go back to the was not fantastic real wage growth of before, but let's say the path, the trend of before, while, as I said before, keeping cost in check and competitiveness and ensuring that inflation goes back to target. Otherwise, let's say, all the effort would be spoiled. So these are some of the old and new challenges. And in the second part of my talk, I will tell you, let's say, 5 lessons that I've learned in my work on collective bargaining over the last more or less 10 years. Some of these lessons may be completely obvious to those of you that have been practicing collective bargaining in your professional or personal life, or those that have been studying collective bargaining from a more industrial relations and political science point of view. But trust me, these were not completely, at least they were certainly not obvious to me when I started, and I think they are still not completely obvious to a crowd of economists. Because where we started, it's a very old story, as you can see from the font of the screenshot, but still, this was the way that economists and policy institutions, so we are in Brussels, including the European Commission, but the OECD, the IMF, and many national institutions thought about collective bargaining in the 90s and even in the early 2000s. So this is the so-called arm-shape hypothesis by Lars Calmfors and Riffel, so two Swedish authors at least, Lars Calmfors, so not people that do not know what collective bargaining is, but the hypothesis at the time was that collective bargaining was able to deliver good labor market outcomes at the extremes. So when it was very centralized or very decentralized. And the rationale was that in both cases, one, because they were completely coordinated and sort of central planning, and in the other case, because they simply allowed market forces to work, collective bargaining was able to internalize, take into account the macroeconomic and, let's say, the more general effects of the collective agreements. Whereas in the middle, as you see in the citation that I put here, the organized forces, what do they write? The organized interest, they are not strong enough to cause major disruption and so to make step forwards, but also not sufficiently encompassing to understand the impact of their decision on the entire economy. So some sectors that maybe, for instance, the typical example is services sectors, non-tradable, maybe making wage agreements that may then have spillovers onto the tradable sector and disrupt, damage the competitiveness of the country, but them without knowing. So this is where we started. And in fact, things have evolved over time. So basically, there was no clear validation for this work, but also just let me say why this was adopted in policy and how it was used, how it was let's say, translated into policy making. So the policy making, at the OECD, we always try to somehow to be fact-based or follow the literature and so on. But the issue was that, okay, we can have two ways of doing collective bargaining back in the 80s, 90s, so very centralized or very decentralized. The issue is that the conditions to be met in order to have a well-functioning, very centralized systems were extremely rare, and therefore the easy solution was to decentralize, to simply dismantle all the institutions that were a little bit in the middle and just go in this case the decentralized way. So this was the easiest, most pragmatic and most enriched way to deliver good labor market outcome through collective bargaining. So there was centralization in mind. People, it's not that they were against the centralization, but the thinking was that it was too complicated to have proper centralization to work with the coordination that is required and so on and so forth. So in the end, until I would say 5, 6, 7 years ago, the recommendations that certainly we have observed also during the Euro crisis in Europe was to make wage setting system more flexible and decentralized collective bargaining. And this is what reforms in Portugal, Spain, Greece in particular have done. However, over time, in the last decade, things have started to complexify. So first of all, this chart only looks at the degree of centralization. What we started realizing is that there is much more than the level of bargaining and the degree of centralization in a collective bargaining system. So the collective bargaining system is a box, and sometimes is a black box of many other items. So certainly you have the level of bargaining, so whether bargaining happens at firm, at sector, or in some cases in the past at national level. But then also for each level of bargaining, there can be different degrees of centralization. So a sectoral level can be both can be in some countries more decentralized than in other countries, or even a firm level in certain countries can be more decentralized than in another country. So it's already important to look at the feature that then make the system more or less flexible, such as the use of extensions, opt-out, favorability principle. Then an important variable, intangible, sometimes certainly not codified, is the role and the way that wage coordination is practiced. It's not something that is codified in legislation. It's based on traditions, on goodwill, on patents, and so on. But it has been shown to be key in ensuring macro flexibility in collective bargaining systems. So to do exactly what I was saying before, so to allow different bargaining actors, even not centralized, to account for the spillovers and the macroeconomic effects of their decision. And finally, a final dimension that I think is still not prominent enough in the discussion is the role of enforcement tools, institutions, or call them as you want, in order, A, of course, to ensure that what has been agreed in collective agreements is fulfilled and realized, but also in unofficially and behind the scenes pushing towards reaching agreements and good agreements. And this, I think, is still something that we should investigate more and think more also when we think about the promoting collective bargaining. So this is the first lesson, going beyond the degree of centralization. The second lesson is that we often focused, and we focused in the past, and we still focus on specific features of collective bargaining. So what is the role of administrative extension? What is the role of opt-out clauses? And so on and so forth. They certainly are very important, and it's very important to have empirical evidence to understand how they work, what is the effect. But not forgetting that at the end of the day, what matters is the box as such, so the package in itself, and not just the sum of the single items. Because we have seen, even recently, reforms or attempt of reforms that have changed one or two items and that either led to nothing or no substantial change. So maybe it was introduced the possibility to opt out and nobody used the possibility to opt out, or in other cases there were introduced few changes and this led to the collapse of the entire bargaining system because the incentive change and so on and so forth. So it's essentially a word of caution when wanting to reform the labor market, that of course one will do it by looking at the specific issues. It's not, we cannot say we do a reform of the collective bargaining. We should say exactly what we want to do, but knowing that the full system works together, let's say. It's not possible to change one item thinking that all the rest will remain the same. At the OECD, we have identified, let's say, 5 main models. This is highly arguable and disputable. There is substantial heterogeneity within these very same models, but still I think they are useful in pushing people to think about different packages. Then, as I said, the packages can be different between one country and another. There is no one single country that is like another, so even similar countries are different. But that being said, it's useful to think about elements that come together in the package and therefore should be thought together. So this is the second lesson. A third lesson, I think a very important one in the policy debate, is that there are different ways of decentralizing. Here I put 2, but in fact, let's say there could be even a third. So the third option, the early one, was let's just go at firm level. So let's just have collective bargaining at firm level. Then in that case, of course, it's fully decentralized. The issue with collective bargaining at firm level is that in many cases, it does not lead to more collective bargaining at firm level. In fact, it leads to less collective bargaining at firm level because in many cases there will be no unions and also no employers able to negotiate at firm level. In a small company, there is no union, and the employer on the management side in many cases has not the skills to negotiate a collective agreement and not even the time in many cases, even if they have the will to do it. So going full full scale to firm level may not be the most promising way to decentralize collective bargaining. So at some point there was a lot of discussion on the German model, also building on the fact that Germany proved to be quite successful in the early 2000s and during the Euro crisis, and therefore on the role that the so-called opening clauses, opt-out clauses can have in promoting more decentralized collective bargaining. However, Germany is not the only model, and one could even discuss whether it's the best way going forward, given that Germany is one of the, let's say, all the European countries where collective bargaining coverage has gone down the most. There are countries which usually we think are, let's say, the reference when we think about social model, collective bargaining, social dialogue, and so on, but sometimes we forget to look exactly how they work, where there are no opt-out clauses, like in Sweden, but there is flexibility inbuilt in the system, inbuilt in the sectoral agreements, because these sectoral agreements, they define broad frameworks, but not only leave space for firm level bargaining, but in fact even call on firm level agreements to redefine and give incentives to both unions and employers to negotiate at firm level, at local level, therefore granted that flexibility that we were looking for. So there are different ways of introducing flexibility. One way is certainly the German way, but there are also other ways, the so-called organized decentralization, and there are also other models of organized decentralization in the Netherlands, in Denmark. It works differently than in Sweden, that I think are worth investigating and thinking about when from a policy point of view, one would like to promote more flexibility. A fourth lesson is that we often focus and talk only about trade unions. So about the role of trade unions, about the weakening in membership in trade unions, in how trade unions are not able to represent the whole of the interest of all workers, and so on and so forth. But in an agreement, it takes two to tango, let's say. There must be someone else on the other side. So the unions are not going to reach an agreement by themselves. So we also need to think about what is the role, what are the incentives, what is the organization, how they work, how they feel, how they are, the employers' organizations. Unfortunately, we have relatively little academic research on employers' organizations. We have less data, but also less qualitative work. But employers' organizations in countries with sectoral bargaining are I would argue, they are more important than trade unions in ensuring the stability and the continuation of sectoral bargaining. Here are basic correlations, but you see that the correlation between collective bargaining coverage, so in a way the variable, the measure that we use, the indicator to measure the reach and the strength of collective bargaining. So you have collective bargaining coverage here on the y-axis, and trade union density is 0.33 or almost zero if you take out these two outliers, Germany and Switzerland. So there is some correlation, but not very strong. So there are countries where there is strong collective bargaining, France, Austria, Italy, relatively less, but still strong in Spain and Portugal, where trade union density is pretty low. And then you have Nordic countries where trade union density is high and collective bargaining coverage is high. But so it doesn't seem to be the key factor explaining collective bargaining coverage. On the other end, if you look the share of employers' organization, first, please notice that the scale is different. So here we go from 0 to 100, here from 40, and even I would say 50 to 100. So the membership in employers' organization in terms of workers covered is stronger in all these countries. And you see that the correlation is much stronger. So 56, then this morning in the train I was thinking that I should check what is without Germany and Switzerland. It will be a bit less strong, but still, you see a clear positive correlation between countries where employers' organizations are relatively weaker, such as Portugal, and collective bargaining coverage is also weaker, and countries where where employers' organization, for various reasons, like in Austria, where basically membership to the chambers is compulsory, but still Belgium, Italy, France, where it's strong and collective bargaining coverage is strong. So if you care about collective bargaining coverage in a sectoral system, you should care a lot about what happens on the employer side. This is, of course, different in countries where collective bargaining happens at company level. In that case, what matters is the ability of workers to set up a union and negotiate with employers. If there are no unions, there is no negotiation, and therefore there is no collective bargaining. Like in the United States, workers have to vote to get a union representation at the workplace, at the plant level, and if they do so, they can negotiate a collective agreement. So the two, trade union density and collective bargaining coverage, in that case go hand in hand. But in other countries, in European countries, this is not the case, and therefore it's key to look at the role of employers' organization. Finally, last lesson learned that I already hinted at that before when I was showing you, let's say, the complexity of collective bargaining, is that the role of enforcement and the role of institutions and formal and informal institutions promoting the good quality labor relations is key and unknown, still relatively unknown to me. I would like to know much more and would like to study that more in more close detail. For instance, the role that mediation offices play in some countries, typically Nordic countries. Here I have the example of Denmark and Sweden, where they play, let's say, they have different roles and they play different roles, but in Denmark, for instance, they're pretty strong because they can call for a ballot vote on the entirety of agreements, therefore reducing very much the power of a minority veto, possible veto player. In Sweden, they have more an informal role in laying the groundwork, persuading, providing information to both parties, informally mediating ex ante, and so on and so forth. But they play a key role. So in Sweden, they were very concerned because, of course, we think about, I'm Italian, we think about Sweden as where everything works well. But that's not the case. Things are tense in Sweden as well. The situation is not always obvious. You can see now with Tesla and the unions, but okay, it's maybe a little bit of a specific story. But in the spring, where they were to renegotiate the collective agreements after the inflation we experienced, the Swedes were also extremely concerned. Will we make it this time? Or we will experience strikes as we have not experienced for the last 20, 30 years? But I think also partly thanks to the role of mediation offices and certainly about the goodwill and the responsibility of both sides, employers and unions, the agreements were reached without 1 day of strike, despite the inflation rate that also Sweden experienced. Some people, some scholars, suggest that the weakening of wage coordination and collective bargaining in Germany, for instance, could be related to the lack of mediation office, mediation institution in Germany. So I think this is an interesting hypothesis. It's an hypothesis, so certainly will not be the only explanation, but I think the role of these institutions should be studied more. So wrapping up a little bit my lessons learned and my talk, I think looking forward, there are a few things that we should think when we think about promoting collective bargaining, especially, for instance, in how to really bring to the ground and implement, for instance, the EU directive. So the first thing is that design of the system matters. It's not just enough to say collective bargaining. So we need to think exactly what it means. And the first important item is to have broad-based representative social partners. That this means not only the share of membership, but also the composition of membership. So whether social partners, even notably unions, which is a little bit the weak side, whether even if they have less members, but are these members representatives of the variety of the workers, the sectors, and so on, or they just represent one piece of the economy. Second is the use of administrative extensions that have been the focus. I did not talk much about today, but has been the focus, quite a lot of excitement over, let's say, certainly in the last 10 years. I think the conclusion as of today is that they can work well under some conditions, and so we should think well about what these conditions are. The model that as a package, as I said before, seems to deliver the best outcome are these models of organized decentralization when one has both high coverage and some flexibility, combined with strong wage coordination. The issue is that on this, I have more questions than answers, and it is that while we know the theory, let's say, while we have some more clear ideas in mind of what we want, it's completely not clear how to reach that. Because very much is based on how actors appropriate the rules, how actors decide to play the game, and how they want to behave, and therefore it's not obvious to introduce flexibility where it is absent. Conversely, it's not obvious to strengthen collective bargaining and maybe to reintroduce or introduce some forms of collective bargaining where there is no bargaining, because as I said before, it takes two to tango. It's not enough. Now you have the possibility to reach a sectoral agreement. Yes, but you have to have two parties that are willing to negotiate and sign that agreement. So this is not obvious. That was the challenge for New Zealand. It's not enough to say, okay, let's import the Belgian model, let's import the Swedish model, because there will be one party, or maybe both parties, but certainly one party will be less keen than the other to play along. And so if the two parties do not sit down and say, yes, I'll try to do my best, things will not happen. So it's not enough to say, okay, let's reintroduce the legal possibility to do collective bargaining. So we have to think quite a lot, and the people in New Zealand have thought quite a lot about how to structure the right incentives in order to somewhat use the stick and the carrot for social partners to negotiate. And finally, wage coordination is great, as I said, but how do you coordinate where there is no tradition and therefore no trust that people will really follow these rules, and there is always the incentive to deviate? If anything, we see more examples of weakening of coordination than of strengthening coordination. So reaching this let's say, finding ways to make the system work better is not obvious where there are not the traditions in place. Second big point is that certainly from a policy point of view, there is work to do to adapt the collective bargaining systems to the new challenges. As I was referring before, I think it's important on the labor side to ensure that workers are correctly classified for the type of work that we do, and so minimize that gray zone between employment and self-employment. However, I think we should also strive to recognize that we will never be able to fully put people in the two boxes, polar boxes of employment and self-employment, and so adapt the labor and competition legislation to a more nuanced structure of the labor market. And that, I think, would be the best way in order to avoid endless fights and back and forth on, are you a self-employed, are you an employee, things that may change from the morning to the night depending on how you behave, on how the employers behave, on how which employers, whether you work for, let's say, Uber or Lyft or whatever, but still you're the same person doing the same job. And therefore, I think in labor market institutions at large should strive to cover all workers irrespective of their formal contract. And finally, of course, social partners may, and I think they should also adapt to this evolving way of working and different types of workers, adapting the structure, opening up. For many years, trade unions were closed to self-employed. Things are changing. Unions are organized as self-employed. Of course, it's challenging. The same for employees' organization. They are also challenged by the newcomers. In Sweden, Tesla is not challenging just the unions. In fact, I think it's challenging more the employers' organizations than the others. In Germany, the weakening of collective bargaining is mainly driven by a weakening or lower engagement on the employer side than on the union side, and so on and so forth. So what social partners can do alone is also very important. So with this, I'm done. I have here, not for now, but for if you put the slides online, you distribute them, a list of some reading that I found useful. It's much longer than that, so just look at the references in our reports, but these are some inspiring articles that I found over my work over the last 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that was really an amazing keynote, very inspiring. If you would agree, we can perhaps take 2 questions from the audience before moving on, if there are any. 2, that's perfect.
Okay. Yeah, thanks very much. Very interesting introduction. I'm Richard Pond from the European Federation of Public Service Unions. So, I mean, what key issue for us really is what's been happening in the public sector. And I know that's an overview, so you can't talk about different sectors. But I mean, I think it is interesting. I don't know what you think about the fact that certainly in terms of equality, collective bargaining in public services has probably been a forerunner of the issue. It's now creating some big controversies, particularly in the Nordic countries. But also in terms of trends, I think it's interesting to highlight the fact that I think in most countries, probably public sector collective bargaining has bucked the trend, that coverage is still very high, including in the UK. You've got agreements in local government and health service that each cover over 1 million workers. In Germany, you're still talking about 90-100% public sector coverage in collective bargaining coverage in the public sector. So I think it's bucked the trends, and I think it may be just interesting to look at that in a bit more detail in terms of how that might influence the rest of the collective bargaining environment. So I don't know if you've got any observations on that. Thanks.
Hi, Henry Hapanal, University of Antwerp. So at the end of the day, I think your story is still, it's a lot about path dependence in terms of how collective bargaining organizations evolve, how they move, what the conditions are for them to move forward in a way. So I'm thinking in terms of the minimum wages directive and the goal for 80% of collective bargaining coverage. And like in my interpretation, at least how the directive is kind of suggesting member states to move forward with that is quite a soft measure of tool still in terms of like, creating kind of this like plans to move forward together with the social partners in kind of a collaborative atmosphere in a way. But in terms of what you've been demonstrating, do you think is this likely to be happening? Are there some countries in Europe that are more or less likely to be able to kind of reverse the tide in terms of collective bargaining coverage decline?
Thank you very much. So yes, indeed, I was essentially referring to collective bargaining in the private sector, but it's true to recall that collective bargaining exists in the public sector, and B, as you recall, this collective bargaining is much stronger, in fact, in the public sector. And I would say C, collective, and that is part the answer to your question is C. What happens in the public sector still has a strong influence also on the private sector. So private sectors, unions and employers in many countries, completely informally, of course, but still are very much influenced about what happens in collective bargaining in the public sector. So that is, on the one hand, possibly positive, at least for the worker side, in terms of being anchored to a sector where collective bargaining is still strong, but possibly negative on two fronts, in my view. The first is that collective bargaining in the public sector has experienced difficulties over the last years, and I guess will still experience some difficulties because budget have been somewhat being restrained and constrained, and therefore the ability also to renew agreements in a meaningful way in many countries is somewhat limited by. We will not enter into whether this is warranted or not, whether the rules and the self-imposed constraints are, but still there are these constraints. And so on the one hand, the reference point being anchored to something that in any case is a bit weakening in terms of outcomes, maybe not in terms of membership and so on, but in terms of outcome, is not certainly as good as in the past, maybe an issue. And second, because I think certainly the call for social partners to somewhat rethink or anyway think how they should adapt to a changing world of work is a bit weaker in the public sector, where, let's say, forms of employment tend to be a bit more standard. There are also many non-standard forms of work in the public sector, but that being said, less than in the private sector. So I fear that, let's say, more innovation on that front will and should come more on the private sector side. And I would say even within the private sector, in those sectors where collective bargaining is weaker, but which also means where unions have and employers have lower members. So innovative practices should come from those sectors where collective bargaining is weak, not from the metalworking. So they can also come from metalworking and chemical sector and so on and so forth, but they should especially come from those sectors where things are not really working, because it's there where we need to find new ways of doing. So that's my two concerns. On the one hand, the strong reference. On the other hand, not forget that the new ways of thinking should come indeed from places and sectors which experience different challenges. On the EU directive, first a minor precision, but I think that is key, is that the 80% is not a goal. It's a reference point. So no country and the directive itself will, from at least a legal point of view, then it may be different from a political point of view, but from a legal point of view will not be evaluated against meeting this target at some point or not, because it's not clearly not stated that it's not a target, but more a threshold which triggers the obligation to come up with an action plan, but it's not a target per se. Will it be successful in beyond the legal issues in concrete? It's difficult to say. Certainly, I think it has already been successful in changing a little bit the policy and the political discourse on social partners, social dialogue, collective bargaining, because we just have to think and read the documents of 10 years ago and those of today, and even written by the very same services and persons, and they are very different. Of course, it's challenging, as I said before, for those countries where collective bargaining happens only at firm level to find ways to bring this let's say, to the next level. So I think all the answer to your question will be on how seriously these action plans will be taken. So the action plan can be a paper saying, okay, here is my action plan with very vague ideas or some ways to show that things are happening, or a serious deep thinking. As I said, it was done in New Zealand. It will be reversed. Maybe it was not the best way of doing it. I don't know. But anyway, serious deep thinking on how to go beyond what we know. So the people in New Zealand thought about really a completely new system. It's not something that exists anywhere. It's not something that at the OECD we had thought about, or nobody had thought about, because they really sat down and started thinking, okay, so how can we make sectoral collective bargaining work in a country where there has not been sectoral collective bargaining for 30 years, and employers do not want sectoral collective bargaining, and unions are not organized in a way to do sectoral collective bargaining. The same in Chile. Chile has never had sectoral collective bargaining, so they will have to think about a system that is different and that works in a country that has more than 10,000 unions. So it's not just employers, but also sectoral bargaining with 10,000 people sat at the table is not very practical from a logistic point of view. So that's where I think the answer is. So whether this action plan from each single country will really make an effort to identify the specific challenges and come up with specific answers. But of course, you need to have the political will at, let's say, political level, at social partner level, and so on and so forth. So maybe in some countries it will work, in others it will not, to be seen. But from a policy objective point of view, I think it has already had the effect to change in a way, to reverse the tide in terms of the way of thinking about the issue.
Thank you so much. And I think we already started our panel debate to some extent, so very exciting to continue later on. But now I would like to welcome to the front my colleague Sam van der Kerkhoven, who will very briefly say a few words about the project and also show you the bargaining simulation tool, and then you can try it out yourself as well. So, Sam.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. So as Caroline has said, I will very briefly show the outline of the project, and then after the break, the colleagues, the partners will each present their contributions. I think with this I can control it wherever I point. Yeah. This slide and this graph may be quite illustrative or interesting to really tackle or point at the problem at hand or the issue at hand. We have the Gini measure for inequality, pre-transfer and post-transfer. So the blue bars, that's before transfers, and the social transfers, that's after the social transfers, I'm sorry, that's the orange bar. And the difference between the two is the gray bar. So you see that to some extent, countries through social policy manage to influence inequality in their economies and their societies. However, if you look at the blue bars in itself before social transfers, there's already a lot of variation in inequality. So what's actually happening before redistribution? Hence also the title of the project, BFORE. There's much more variation even than you can afterwards redistribute. So here's our theoretical framework. It's a cycle starting from the economy, production and consumption, which then leads to labor market pre-distribution, and who's involved in discussing, negotiating this pre-distribution? It's social partners, labor policy and collective bargaining, which then gives the basis to finance social security, to get tax revenues, which then can be redistributed in terms of income and wealth. And finally, this leads to some degree of well-being and equality, which is the basis, again, for people to be able to work, to be able to consume, to be wanting to contribute and creating all externalities that make the cycle go around and work back again. So in this project, we're wondering what is actually this interaction, what is even the perceived trade-off or combination, the policy mix of relying to some extent on collective bargaining, on market pre-distribution, on the other hand, relying on social policy, on redistribution. Another framework for this is from the Iverson and Wren 98 paper on the trilemma of the service economy, where they say states, welfare states, have one thing to sacrifice. Either you accept a budget deficit, meaning you let the state invest more. In the supply and demand framework, it's actually to shift demand a bit so that workers can get something more through all the support you get from state services or state employment. You risk unemployment if there's very heavy bargaining or it's company bargaining, much in the Comforts and Driffel spirit, raising the wages but at the expense of employment. And then if you let the market play out and you go for the liberal or the neoliberal welfare state model, then it's about low wages or pushing labor demand through requiring more flexibility of workers. So those are a bit the choices. It's of course a model, and in reality, countries will have a policy mix where they try to do a blend of these different kind of measures or different kind of strategies. But the different welfare state models, the Christian democratic model, social democratic model, and neoliberal model can very well be characterized by these choices to be made. So then, what's the context for this project? What's the social economic context in Europe today and some time ago when we applied for this research? We are post-austerity. There's some recipes basically oriented at the supply side of the economy to tackle the crisis, and they haven't been the best solutions, such as quantitative easing, etc. So post-austerity, there was the idea that there's something else that needs to be done. There's the COVID crisis with critical occupations that have been continuing to work, have had to continue to work at lower wages. So there's a sentiment, also a popular sentiment, that we live in an unequal world, that there's increasing precariousness and inequality. And there is declining wage shares. There's many reasons for the declines in the wage share. It could be the organization power of the labor force through increased flexibility, so it's harder to mobilize people, deregulation, deunionization, a composition effect of shifts towards sectors, economic activities with a lower labor share, financialization and huge profits in the finance sector and in real estate, specialization, which is the separation of companies and the activities of companies into different sectors so that wages can be suppressed in the support or the supply companies to the core companies. And the effect of this is that there's growing profits, meaning a lot of liquidity, many takeovers, downward adjustments of profit expectations as consumption suffers from this, hence pressure for further wage moderation. And that's in some countries, that's a cycle that we also see all of the time. So how to break this, of course? Policy responses in the past have been oriented at competition rules, antitrust rules, providing welfare provisions and social policy, which has much been studied. But now there's this paradigm shift, which Andrea Garnero has also pointed at in his first slides, of policy towards a role for collective bargaining, a role for social dialogue. So we have the Pillar of Social Rights in 2017. We have the Minimum Wage Directive. We have the Pay Transparency Directive this year. We have this call for the strengthening of collective bargaining. And we have the OECD that also has nice titles such as Negotiating Our Way Up. To the right, you see a graph with, on the one hand, on the x-axis, union density, and then bargaining coverage on the other hand. And it's quite interesting that the same graph just appeared with a weak correlation. But what you see here, there's more going on than just a linear effect. What you see is that union density is actually sufficient but not a necessary condition. That's what logically this means for coverage. If there is high union density, there is higher coverage. If there's low union density, it depends. It depends either on the history, maybe it's fading union density but the institutions are in place, or maybe there's other ways of creating coverage, such as trying to make most of the extension mechanism. What we have learned in this project is that structure and origin varies. So we may want to go to the same structure of collective bargaining in Europe and have some conversion in that respect, but we will not have all the same histories in all the different European member states. And that's what you find out, is that collective bargaining does work. There is this effect, and I will show a couple of graphs of correlations, but it's hard to know whether it's about the box or whether it's about what is in the box, what is on the bargaining menu, what are the different instruments and what effect do they have. How does it actually work, coming from the micro level, company level sectors, and then moving up to national level bargaining? What are the different steps to be taken to make collective bargaining work? One other conclusion is that often the effect it has on inequality and equality, it's unintended. So it starts from distributing rents, distributing productivity increases, and it ends by creating equality between workers of all kinds, men, women, by age, by ethnic origin, but that wasn't the first intention in the first place. So strengthening collective bargaining, it has been said before, it's also about to stop falling union density as a sufficient condition, and also to prevent falling bargaining coverage. What you can see here is that bargaining coverage is more stable in many countries, many clusters that we have separated here, but on the average, it's also falling in Europe. So there could be a lag. Once the power in numbers is gone, it's also harder to maintain the strength of institutions. I think the Netherlands is a good example of such a situation. So we studied this from the policy point of view, from theory. We have some analytic approaches, one of which is trying to work with all the data that's available, and that's getting better and better. OECD is also doing its work there. Analytically, there's also a tool that we've developed. So you can try being a negotiator yourself. I will present this next. Then there's national case studies, and there's a comparison with countries that are in these groups, whether they reflect more or less what our countries from the partners in the project, what their realities are they representative or not? So the countries here are Finland, Belgium, Spain, Ireland, Croatia, and Lithuania. Here we see one such graph from the ILO collective bargaining report, where you see as the union density rate is higher, then the inequality, the ratio of the 5th percentile over the 1st or the 10th over the 5th is decreasing. And here's from one of our own contributions, similar correlations between collective bargaining coverage and the decile ratio of the 90th percentile over the 10th and the low pay incidence. And you see there's the correlation there between. And also, if we do regression analyses, this correlation, it is significant. However, if you do within country analyses, it's not so successful. So it's not as simple, again, as just changing one parameter and having immediate effects on inequality. What we want to know is what kind of instruments did work and do work. One way to find out is to experiment ourselves. And so we've developed this bargaining simulation tool. I think in terms of time, I have just 10 minutes to present the tool, but we will not run it in real time. We can do it in the break. I invite you to do it. The website is, go back, sim.before.be. Okay, so it's a bargaining simulation game, meaning that in this game, you will be the negotiator for a company. It's interactive. And your decisions will affect wages, employment levels, inequalities, such as the gender pay gap, age pay gap, ethnic pay differences, differences between white and blue-collar workers, which may have different contributions to the productivity of the company. And you will get some feedback on this on a social dashboard. So basically what it reflects is social dashboard in the pillar of social rights on the one hand, and how to distribute the productivity gains or the growth of the economy. If you would aggregate all the different companies, you would end up with the same kind of choice that policymakers at the national level need to take to control the wage share, if they do. And you will learn afterwards through the choices, through the different rounds that you do, what your choices have been, whether they have been successful in creating more equality for your workforce, whether you have managed to increase wages, whether you have created or lost employment, and whether you have been able to change this and whether you made the right choices. So you can also do this with colleagues or with a group. I do some sessions with trade unionists and trainers. And run through it, do one round just to get a grip and so that people know how it works, and then do 5 to 10 rounds so you get a learning effect of what happens over a number of rounds. You get your result, and afterwards there's an evaluation, a little survey. This is, I hope you complete it and send it, because this is very useful for us to know which preferences, which choices are made by which people. Do women bargain in favor of gender pay equality, or do directors, do managers bargain about specific elements, maybe more employment and wages? Do they have other ideologies? This could show through this tool. What you see is first a social dashboard. We will see it on the next slide. You have to make wage claims. So what percentage of the profit increase or the gains of the company do you want to claim as a unionist? Which method of increase do you want? Whether you want a percentual increase, whether you want an absolute pay increase, whether you want to have bonuses, choices that in real life have to be made. And then which groups of workers do you want to promote? By gender, ethnic origin, the job category, blue or white collar workers, even union members versus non-union members, which is a choice in some countries that does exist. Okay. So here's this social dashboard. It's a table. And you see that in this case, the company has an average wage in the workforce of 2,457 euros. The figures are in each run randomized. So here there's a very small age pay gap of 0.88%. In my presentation, I will show that this is indeed a very small pay gap. There's a gender pay gap here of 4%, which could be realistic. And there's some evolution compared to the past round. In this case, for instance, there has been more hirings in the company, and we've managed to reduce the ethnic pay gap. So that's a success if this has been the goal. Okay. So the gains in this company in each simulation will be between 1 and 8%. You can claim up to 5% more. Inflation will vary between 1 and 3%, so we try to keep it within realistic margins. And if you claim too much, there will be a penalty in terms of hirings or layoffs. One thing that I noticed in the sessions people sometimes don't realize is if the company's gains are 6%, they will claim 4% saying the boss can also have his share, not realizing basically that also profits will increase by the same percentage. So there's some learning effect there. Pay gaps, it's always interesting to discuss with people what a pay gap really means, what is behind it, if it's a matter of equal pay for equal work, or if it's just a difference between different categories of workers, men and women, who may have different labor time, who may have different tasks, and whether that's just or not. Preferences there can be different. There's wage inequality, residual wage inequality that's very clearly unequal pay for equal work. There's the pay differentials between white and blue collar workers, and then the question on having a union premium or not, or negotiating in favor of the insiders of your members or not. You can simulate this in different ways. You can do it individually. You can also make little teams and have somebody giving instruction and then follow up whether the negotiators, which would be your members if you're a union secretary, your members at the companies, whether they follow the instructions, or you can try to negotiate and agree with a team of 5 people on the targets and therefore simulate different ways of bargaining. Here's one example of the feedback that we got after doing such a session. We asked some questions. What is the bargaining strategy? How much inequality do you consider too much? What is fairness? And should unions be the ones tackling inequality and poverty issues? So here we have this feedback from a group of female negotiators. And they were tackling inequalities quite a lot and trying to maintain purchasing power in the first place. What degree of inequality is a red flag? Then there were many people arguing there shouldn't be any inequality. 0.1% is too much inequality. And then afterwards, some people were saying that they were struggling in their companies to give higher wages or more premiums to the people that did more efforts. So there was some contradiction there. Then on the question, what is considered to be fair? Is it just equal opportunities? Is it equal pay for equal work? Or is it egalitarianism and we're the same, or we have equal value and this should be guaranteed by already at the company level, already through collective bargaining? So here's precisely this question. Should unions tackle inequality or poverty? Some said yes, social justice matters. Then a little bit less than half of them said unions should do their part, but it's just by negotiating fair wages, and that's it. And nobody said it wasn't a concern for trade unionists or social partners. So that's a short presentation. Again, I repeat, the website is sim.before.be, and I invite you, if you have some time, if you have a computer, to try it out, to give some feedback if you like it, to forward it to your friends and colleagues, and hopefully this can be illustrative also of what we're trying to find with this project. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So now we have our coffee break. We would like to welcome you back here in this room at 11 for some presentations, but really in the meantime, don't hesitate to try out the simulation tool, and then we see each other again soon. Thanks. Okay, and then I can lift it.
Okay. It will be locked, but I can open it.
Okay then. Okay, thanks very much. Thank you. Yes. Writer, the moderator of the panel, he was asking if it's possible to print the sticky notes because he has them on a computer, but of course it's a model printer.
Yeah, okay. Then I will need my computer.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I can do it, but how much time? Right after?
Yeah, so we have now 1 hour for the presentations, and then it's immediately the panel.
Okay, then maybe I send you the presentation to your laptop. Or
Yeah, if possible, that works as well.
yeah, because
Yeah, if you send me the presentation.
okay, let's do it like
so
that.
we will use my computer
Because
instead.
it will start in 5 minutes. I will be late.
Exactly. Okay.
So if you can leave it there and
I will have to use it because I'm taking notes, but I can put
okay.
it here when
Okay,
you
then
will
you
be
can.
speaking.
Okay,
You're
thanks so much.
taking
Thank
notes.
you.
Of course, yeah.
Or maybe Alex, do you have your laptop upstairs?
He needs to leave, huh?
Ah, you need to leave. Okay.
So you will speak first?
Okay.
Yeah, can you inform Delia that you are the first? Maybe I will come immediately, but just in case, I will send it to you.
Oi. Oh no.
Finland, right?
We have the wrong Inga.
Maybe we just don't use it.
Yeah, maybe we change the slide.
My title has changed, but it's okay.
Okay.
I'm chief researcher.
So we take this down.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm chief researcher, but that's okay. Yeah. Okay.
And then
Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a lovely coffee break and were able to test out the simulation tool. So now we will have a 1 hour time slot where we will go in detail and present some of the results of our country case studies. We have 6 cases and 1 hour, so we kindly asked all colleagues to really be focused on the key messages for their country, and I will have to be quite tough also on the time management, so I'm sorry in advance. But we will start with the presentation on Ireland by Alex from the SEPS team, so please.
Thank you, Caroline. Just waiting to see if everything works properly. Okay. Okay, perfect. So yes, as Caroline said, so I will present the country report for Ireland. So just an introductory slide. So I start with the graph, so a bunch of economic indicators. So there's a GDP growth, the unemployment rate on the left axis, and the employment rate on the right axis. And so you can see that actually Ireland has gone through major changes over the last 35, 40 years, let's say. So with a period of, can I point? Yeah. A period of marked growth, even a catch up to EU levels, followed by a sharp decrease during the Great Recession, a large increase in unemployment also, and then a recovery in the aftermath. So after basically the exit from the emergency plan. So at the same time, industrial relations, they also underwent major changes. So the period of high growth coincided with a sustained period of social dialogue. So that's named social partnership. So everything was centralized. So wage bargaining happened at the national level. During the Great Recession, there was almost a total collapse of industrial relation institutions, and then a progressive recovery as the economy recovered, actually. And I will discuss a bit also the COVID-19 pandemic, because it was a key period. I think some of our speakers, they touched upon the fact that social partners were involved in short-time work schemes. And so that's the case in Ireland. So just quickly to present the industrial relation framework in Ireland. So usually it's characterized as voluntarist. So what does that mean is that employer and trade union can freely engage in collective negotiation. But the key point in Ireland is that at least common law, like the constitution, guarantee the right also to not engage. And so a key thing in Ireland is that there is no statutory recognition of trade unions. So in such a regime, that means that usually both unions and employers, they like to negotiate among themselves, and they don't like intervention from the government. And the role of the government in that case is to offer a proper framework for these negotiations to happen. So through conflict resolution bodies, for instance. So of course here this is a bit the picture, the overall picture, but the reality is a bit more complex. So I have a bit some legislative text. So because actually in Ireland, there's a key conflict, let's say, or a key opposition between all the legislative texts on industrial relations, which are collective in nature, and the constitution and common law that actually guarantees this freedom for employers not to engage in collective negotiation. And so if you want to track the evolution of industrial relation in Ireland, it's cases of the government legislates to allow trade unions and employers to bargain. And then some employers, they usually bring a case to the High Court or to the Supreme Court based on the Constitution. And usually the Supreme Court rules that these industrial relation acts are unconstitutional. And so it's back and forth like this in Ireland. And actually, just recently in 2022, the Supreme Court ruled that one of these key mechanisms that I will mention later for sectoral negotiation, it actually ruled that it was finally constitutional. So these are the Industrial Relation Act. So the Workplace Relation Act also I mentioned, so this is for conflict resolution. And so there's statutory minimum wage in Ireland since 2000. So in 2015, there was a reform, so an amendment act to the minimum wage that introduced and that created a low pay commission where social partners sit with experts, and they're supposed to provide some indication on the raise of the minimum wage for the government. Yeah, and so one key thing for the minimum wage is that so this low pay commission actually pushed for Ireland to introduce this living wage, so in line with the adequate minimum wage directive. And so the government has committed to introduce the living wage by 2024, 2026. I have it out, 2026. And so this is a huge change actually for Ireland. So that requires a large increase in the minimum wage. And so actually for 2024, so 1st of January, the minimum wage will increase by €1.40 in Ireland, which is the biggest increase ever recorded. So if you look at social partners, just to mention, so there's two peak level confederation. So IBEC on the employer side, ICTU, so the Irish Congress of Trade Unions. So they all have, so I think IBEC has something like 40 affiliates, ICTU has 46. And so they played a significant role during the social partnership era, but since then their role has decreased. And what is important is to note that affiliates, so in particular on the trade union side, they tend to enjoy a certain degree of autonomy, which is in line also with the level of bargaining, as we will see, because bargaining tends to happen at the company level. Just to mention, so tripartism, because of this social partnership era, there's a sort of tradition of social dialogue, or at least that left some some incentive to keep on social dialogue. And so one of the key body currently in Ireland, so this so-called LEF, so Labour Employer Economic Forum, which it's a tripartite, so government, employer, and workers. And actually this LEF, so that struggled at the start to find its place, that was seen by the government more as a consultative body, it actually played a key role during COVID. And so during the interview, we had on the employer side, the interviewee said that it was actually one of the biggest success story of COVID, the LEF. But I will come back to this also. So just on wage bargaining, so predominant level it's company today. There's some procedures for sectoral bargaining in Ireland. So I'm mentioning these three here. So maybe just to mention, so the first two, so these JLC, Joint Labor Committees, and sectoral employment orders, what is important is that they have an extension mechanism that is embedded in the procedure. And here the Joint Labor Committees in particular, so these are specific to sectors that are low paid. So there's a list of sectors, nine or 10 I think currently, where these kind of bodies can be set up. That would then need to, usually that sets some minimum rates of pay that then apply to the whole sector. And so here why I'm mentioning JLC, it's so because we touched upon this 80% goal, or this 80%, I don't know how to say it, it's not a hard target as it was mentioned, but a key, so Ireland, as we will see, you have the data here, so the coverage is there for Ireland. So Ireland is way below the 80%. And so in the strategy of at least, not the government, but so this left here, they issued a report recently where they clearly identified JLC as a key body to raise, okay, already, okay, sorry. As a key body to raise the collective bargaining coverage, actually. Okay, so, and just to mention, yes, the public sector is still a national level, so it's still highly centralized. So here I have some data on inequalities. I think the key point is that over these 35 years, there's been a decrease in inequality in Ireland. So of course, there's been all these economic developments at the same time, so it's hard to actually disentangle what is industrial relation and what is just economic factors. And actually, we didn't have access to data to analyze more precisely this question. What I would just say is that Ireland is an interesting case because Ireland underwent through all these changes in the legislation on industrial relation, and so that can potentially be exploited to analyze some impact on inequalities. So here I have a quick review of the three periods I mentioned. Maybe just to mention the recovery. So yeah, really during the Great Recession, all institutions of collective bargaining collapsed. So it was really company bargaining and nothing else. Not in the public sector, of course. In the public sector, there was this so-called concession bargaining where they engage in accepting wage moderation, wage decrease even, in exchange for maintaining employment. And so during the recovery, actually, so with the economic recovery actually came some important reforms that started to reinstate some of the key industrial relation institutions that had been that disappeared during the Great Recession. So actually the JLC, so these joint labor committees, the sectoral employment orders, so the LEF I mentioned was created in 2016. And so of course this period of recovery, if you look at, okay, I couldn't show the indicators, but it associated with the decrease in inequalities, and of course at the same time there's a recovery in industrial relation institutions. So to which extent the two can be connected, yeah, I don't have a definitive answer, but it's interesting to note this co-movement. And so here just to mention, and then I guess I'll conclude on this. So I mentioned the LEF during COVID. So this labor employer economic forum. So actually, he played a key role in setting up this short-time work scheme. They play a key role also in developing health protocol to allow workers to restart working. And so actually, in this sense, one can argue that because they play this key role in allowing workers to keep working, they actually probably helped mitigate the negative income effect of the COVID pandemic. Okay. Well, I will stop here then. Sorry.
Great, thank you. So, now we have the presentation on Belgium.
Let's see. Fingers crossed for the... Yeah, okay. Slides are working well. So Belgium, and the subtitle is A Model for Europe. It has already been said before the break. Do we really have a model of one country that we can export to other countries? And I will give some arguments in favor and maybe some arguments against that. This is the wage structure in Belgium. It's a building built after the Second World War, going from social benefits to net wages, and everything in between is governed by social partners. Social partners that have a very high degree of coverage, as has been seen. It's close to 100%. There's a high union density rate. It's fading, but it's still at around 50%. There's an employer density rate that's 75% of employment is in companies with that are associated to the Employers Federation. So they are in control of the system. It's a three-dimensional system: extensive collective bargaining. The vertical dimension is the coordination between the different levels of bargaining with the principle of favorability. Each additional agreement should improve upon higher order norms and respect them. So, for instance, one higher order norm we have in Belgium is the national minimum wage concluded in the National Labour Council, which is agreed upon by the social partners. It's not a statutory minimum wage. Based on this, the sectors can go further and have higher sectoral minimum wages in the joint committees. Because of extension, the Ministry of Labour that can extend collective agreement to non-signing parties, the principle of universalism is also taken into account. It creates a level playing field, and it's a social correction to the market economy. Whether or not you're a member of the trade union, you will benefit from the wages that are negotiated for you. There's a freedom of collective bargaining, which is now threatened a bit by the wage norm, and I'll talk about this in a minute, through the Act of 1968, which is the act that actually builds this entire structure. And there's also the dimension of debt. It's not only about wages and working time, but the social partners are also involved in governing social security ever since the Social Pact of 1944 at the end of the Second World War. There's the works councils, where at the shop floor there's involvement and some degree of co-decision making when it's about prevention and safety. And there's regional councils that are also involved in training, in investment, in innovation, and other kind of topics, and labor market intermediation. So it's a very thorough system, but the criticism has always been to collective bargaining that it creates some insider-outsider dynamics. And indeed, in the project, through the interviews that we did with the different stakeholders, we noticed that at the company level, collective bargaining is about wages. It's about what has been the gains for the company and what we can get for the workers. At the sectoral level, on the other hand, it's about employment. It's also about training, having funds for training, setting the right wages to attract workers to that particular sector and train for it. And at the national level, unemployment gets taken into account. So each additional level has other kinds of interest and other externalities it creates. A couple of them are left behind still. For instance, with respect to the national level, the youth participation rate for migrants is below par. So this is something that should be worked on, and it's not really on the radar of social dialogue as of yet. At the sectoral level, we see that there's shortages in certain sectors, construction and the care sector, that are inadequately dealt with. And at the company level, we see that these dynamics to improve wages lead to tax evasion, to fiscal optimization of wages, which undercuts social security. Two main instruments of collective bargaining in Belgium. One is the wage indexation, that's famously known. It's a cost of living agreement that's agreed upon in all sectors. Actually, 84% of wage increases in Belgium are wage indexations. It's not a unique model. In other countries, there's also sectors, companies that have clauses with cost of living adjustment, but in Belgium, it's automatic, it's generalized, it's affecting almost 100% of the workforce. What it does is it keeps wages real. It does not affect the wage distribution itself or the shape of it. It just shifts it whenever prices increase. The advantage of this is that it prevents divergence between sectors, because some sectors will always manage to negotiate higher wages, but others will not. Through the wage indexation, also these sectors with lower productivity increases have at least wages that are kept real. Sometimes it's insufficient. For instance, with the energy and the basic prices that had high inflation last year, we saw that some households did have a consumption pattern that was not adequately covered by just the inflation, just the wage indexation for the workers, and the state intervened with linear subsidies, which actually increased inequalities. But I would say that's just a one-off effect. Then the second instrument is the wage norm. It's an upper margin for wage growth in Belgium, and currently it's set at 0%. So basically wages in Belgium cannot grow. It's the Central Economic Council that does the calculation and pegs our wage evolutions to those expected in the neighboring countries, the Netherlands, Germany and France. In 2017, this law was reinforced, so now it's actually punishable by law or sanctionable by law if companies would promise higher wage increases to workers. So I have here the image of a bridge over a river, and the river would be competition or competitiveness and the competition power of our economy. And so to overcome this, they constructed this wage norm to moderate wages, to centrally control wages. But we've been reinforcing the bridge so far that it's maybe even stopping the flow. The idea behind it is solidaristic wage policy. When we joined the Eurozone, we lost our devaluation mechanism, which we have had to use in the 80s, and that's famously known. To be able to still do this, basically they need the wage norm. As a compensation for the indexation mechanism that increases the minima, there's the wage norm to offer some limits to that. And to prevent also sectoral divergence, there's the central wage coordination through it. But there's a couple of paradoxes. We want to limit wage costs, but basically what the wage norm is doing is it's restricting collective bargaining. It's even almost deafening collective bargaining. It's pegging the wages and the wage growth in Belgium to the trading partners, but it's as if there is no sectoral variation in the wage evolutions in these trading partner countries. It's also at odds with the ILO Convention 98 of freedom of bargaining. And another paradox is that it imposes a maximum margin which is interpreted as a minimum target. And as we are Belgians, we're specialized in finding evasion mechanisms, fiscal optimization of wages, which then reduces social security contributions. All the bonuses, all the different mechanisms that we found to work our way around this wage norm has actually created more complexity. However, we're still doing good. If you look at inequality, the Gini figures in Belgium, pre-transfer, post-transfer, are low inequality figures. Same thing with the decile ratios, other measures of inequality. We are in the neighborhood of our Scandinavian brothers and sisters. In terms of working poor, we are at an all-time low now, and there's just an in-work poverty rate of 3.6%. In all our neighboring countries, this is fluctuating more and higher. In terms of gender inequality, in each age bracket, we have one of the lowest gender pay inequalities in Europe. That's the black dot here on the chart for all the different age groups. There's a tradition of negotiating around age inequality or equality ever since the 70s, corresponding to European directives on discrimination and fair pay. And then it has accumulated into the Gender Pay Gap Act in 2012, and now we have the European directive that follows suit. As far as age inequality goes, we see that Belgium is a bit in the middle of the bunch, with a 50% wage increase after a 30-year career. So despite having seniority schemes mainly for white-collar workers, it does not lead to excesses. Actually, it decreases inequalities among all age groups between them. Then there's one focus in the reports, which is on the retail trade sector, and that's a very interesting case, because it's a low-paid sector in every country. So on the left-hand side, you see that in Belgium, it's paid below average wages. But if you look at retail sector in Belgium compared to retail sector in other European countries, we're closer to the average. I'm almost finished. We're closer to the average wage than most other countries, with the exception of Sweden and Slovakia. So what are they doing well? There's a high unionization rate. There are 5 joint committees on retail trade or on food trade. And there's all the mechanism, wage indexation, seniority bonuses, even flexible income plans nowadays. And there's favorable company agreements. But this also poses trends and threats. We see market concentration and internationalization, Carrefour, Auchan, Intermarché, Albert Heijn taking over a Belgian retail trade industry and being at odds with Belgian social dialogue. At the same time, these big companies are franchising into smaller companies to shop towards a joint committee with more favorable or lower wage costs. There's, of course, a trend of non-standard work, flexi-job, student work taking over from regular work, pseudo-self-employed, and even the logistic sector taking over some parts of retail sector. And then there's technological change, putting pressure on workers, on their skills, and on their working time. So is it a model for Europe? On the one hand, we could say Belgium, its mission accomplished. We have a Ghent system with multi-level actors, service unions, representative organizations, high union density, all the statistics that I showed, low inequalities. On the other hand, it's a system that's in an existential crisis. The social security that was built in the wake of the Second World War, the governance over it by social partners is now gradually getting lost. There's the paradoxes of the wage norm law, and there's increasing judicialization of collective bargaining, of labor issues that replaces the autonomy of social partners and the dialogue. And there's low regional participation rates and a high tax which is not dealt with by collective bargaining nor by the state. So there's the question, how much do we rely on collective bargaining and how much do we trust the state is going to govern this? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Then I would like to invite the colleagues from our Croatian team to the floor. Yes.
Hello, everybody. I'm Predak from Croatia, and I would like to replace people who are from my institute. Otherwise, we are a small institute of public finance, and I use this opportunity to express my gratitude to Caroline and to Sam to invite us to this project, and also per ringraziare Andrea per sua presentazione straordinaria. If we go further, no. Our report presents current situation in Croatia. Such analysis is quite complex because in Croatia there is no stable and comprehensive sources about collective bargaining and industrial relationship. Employers and workers have the right, without any restrictions, to establish and join employers association and trade unions. Collective bargaining in Croatia has been mostly and still is decentralized in the private sector and quite centralized in public sector. On the side of the employers, there is Croatian Employers Association, the only relevant national social partner, while on the side of workers, there are Free Trade Unions Confederation with around 230,000 members, what means that trade union density is relatively low, around 20%. While membership in Croatia is relatively stable in public sector, in private sector it is continuously decreasing in last 20 years. Now is around 20%, but only 10% in small and medium enterprises And in big enterprises with 250 employers, it's quite sufficient, around 30%. There are some reasons for such a decrease. I wouldn't go into details because these cases are almost universal in Europe. Growth of self-employment, what we heard today, increased employment in small and medium enterprises. Many young employees do not find any reasons to join trade unions and so on. At the end of 2021, there were around, for small country, you should be aware that Croatia is something like 3.8 million people and 1.10 employees in public and private sector. There are 580 valid collective agreements which regulate the right to about 670,000 employees. What is quite high coverage rate of all workers. That means that Croatia has quite high rate of collective agreement, and it's interesting that there is no changes in last, one could say, almost 7 or 8 years. However, there is no uniform system of collective bargaining regarding the type of agreement, and therefore it is difficult to describe the main characteristic of bargaining. There is possibility for administrative extension of collective bargaining to all collective agreement to all employees in sector, but in last 7 or 8 years, only 2 collective agreements, branch collective agreement or sectoral collective agreement have been extended to all employees in 2 sectors, construction and catering and tourism. This catering and tourism is a part what Sam did for retail sector, we did it for catering and tourism. Gross minimum wage, very briefly, increased significantly in this period 2010-2023. You could say that's relatively small, but furthermore, you should be aware that it increased in this period for 87.4%. However, due to the present inflation and pressure, even this high increase in minimum wage wouldn't be sufficient to protect living standards of its recipients. Although minimum wage protects low wage workers against poverty, they have relatively limited benefit from this, particularly for bigger families. The government introduced an increase in non-taxable part of wages and salaries, and therefore the workers on minimum wage are not obliged to pay personal income tax. And of course, this improved their net wages and improved their living standards, but it's not probably sufficient. Income inequality in Croatia is a little bit lower, or better to say, than expected. One would expect that it is very high. It was very high, but it isn't, and it is 0.30. Gini coefficient is 0.30, which is exactly the same as for EU 25, EU 15, and EU 10. And it, according to last data for last few years, it slightly decreased to 0.29. Croatia is trying to reduce income inequality primarily through tax system and social welfare, but minimum wage is an important but not a sufficient tool to reduce poverty and income inequality. Until now, in Croatia, through collective agreement, almost nothing has been done to alleviate income inequality. That's not good. Therefore, there is obviously need to improve collective agreement. And only 2 small slides. We analyze, as Sam did it for retail, we did it for tourism because it's an important sector of Croatian economy. Tourism is experiencing growing requirement problems, particularly for waiters and cooks, but also for cleaners and helpers in a hotel. However, due to unfavorable job conditions, relatively low wages, seasonal nature of work, limited possibilities for professional promotion, and limited employment possibility out of season, young persons are not willing to enroll in these education programs. Of course, for tourism, there is quite clear high level of human capital is needed, which can only be achieved by full respect of all employees, transparent decision making, and online and on-time information of accepted decision. Current situation, let us summarize the most important messages. Current institutions in Croatia are relatively weak, while the regulatory framework is prone to constant changes which cause legal uncertainty. Collective negotiation on sectoral level in Croatia is seriously underdeveloped. Although training and skills are very important in modern society, they are not included in collective bargaining and in collective agreements in Croatia. And therefore, in collective agreement, there is need to include topics like income inequality and other neglected issues. There is obvious need to improve collaboration and competition and cooperation between trade unions and Croatian Employers Service Association. And one of the most preconditions for that is enhance of mutual trust, which is currently very low. Thank you for your attention. On time, right? Huh?
Excellent presentation. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Then we hand over to Finland. Do you need that?
Hi everyone. So I'm presenting key findings for Finland. Oops. Oh, so let me see. So just a few words about the background. Finland is a country with a long tradition of collective agreements, and in the long run, Finland has been known to be a contract society, where decisions, whether they are related to wages or other terms of employment or broader societal matters, have been done through negotiation, cooperation, and compromises among social partners. Another important framework condition is also that Finland is an open small economy where the role of export for economic growth is significant, and that therefore the competitiveness issues are very relevant. And Finland can be regarded to be part of the Nordic model, and the traditional Nordic model, there are three main pillars. One is responsible macroeconomic policies, the other is coordinated multi-tiered collective bargaining, and the third is universal welfare state. So collective bargaining has a very important role in this Nordic model. Oops. Just not getting the... No, now, okay. So, in Finland, part of the wage setting is determined by market forces and part is regulated by collective agreements and legislation. So going to the level of bargaining, so collective bargaining takes place as a combination of sectoral and company level bargaining, and of these two levels, the sectoral level is the predominant, although the role of local level bargaining has also increased in Finland. And what is important from inequality perspective is that collective agreements define the minimum level for the terms and conditions of employment applicable in the particular sector. So at the company level, it's always possible to agree on better terms and conditions, but not on worse. This is important. Going to the scope of collective bargaining, in Finland, collective bargaining is an essential part of the labor market, and the scope of collective bargaining includes not only wages and working times, but many such issues like minimum wages, holidays, social provisions that are regulated by law in many other European countries. So this is an important factor. And then if we think about the types of pay rises, so there are different how much of the pay is determined at the collective agreements, at the sectoral level, how much is left to the local level. There are different varieties. At the one end, there are total determination of wage rises at the local level, so-called figureless agreements, and at the other end are general wage increases. And there are divisions between sectors and between white-collar and blue-collar workers in this. So this is also relevant. And then what is important feature of the collective bargaining in Finland is coordination. So we have both horizontal and vertical coordination. So horizontal coordination is done by pattern bargaining. Although there is no consensus on this, by strong cooperation of the employer organization in the private sector, pattern bargaining has been applied to a great extent in the latest agreements. And this means that the export-oriented industries set the norm for the pay rise, which the other industries cannot exceed. There's also vertical coordination. The firm level agreements follow the guidelines fixed by sectoral level agreements. And characteristic and pivotal feature of the collective bargaining system in Finland is also the high collective bargaining coverage. And this is due to the high organization rates, but also the extension mechanism we have in Finland. We have also the peace obligation, which is an important ingredient. Going to the inequality and collective bargaining. So in Finland, when we look at wage inequality and income inequality, Finland is has one of the lowest income and wage inequalities in the European context. And similarly, if we look low pay incidence or in-work poverty rate, we find a similar case. And the situation has been quite stable during the last decades. There has been increase in income, total income inequality, but it's not related to collective bargaining. It's related to legislation and political decisions and such issues. Just wanted to show you the, now I went too far. Just saying briefly, what are the features of the Finnish collective bargaining system that might mitigate wage inequality? Union strength, two-tier multi-employer collective bargaining, high collective bargaining coverage, collective bargaining agreements set the minimum wage floors and have fallback provisions, coordination of collective bargaining via pattern bargaining. Also, the form of pay increase is possibility to have euro-based pay increases for the lowest paid or hybrid pay increase models. So Finland wage growth rates do not only depend on collective agreements, but also on wage drift, and the role of wage drift varies by industries. And now showing you the, just very briefly, on the left-hand side, we have the index of wage and salary earnings and real earnings. And what has happened in Finland for nominal wages and real wages. We see that the annual increase of nominal earnings has been on average 2.4%, real wages 0.9%, excluding the latest year when the inflation rate was very high. Okay, just skipping the wage drift part. Then the sectoral analysis was done concerning hotels and restaurants. So why this sector? It is among two of the lowest paying industries in Finland. There's a lot of, it's female dominated, it has a lot of atypical work and a lot of involuntary, of atypical work, especially a lot of involuntary part-time work. And low pay and precarious nature of employment and underemployment are combined in this industry in Finland. And it has also suffered from the COVID pandemic more than many other industries. Just showing you the, again, the development of, now I'll just focus on the right-hand figure, showing you the index of wage and salary earnings and real earnings in this sector and all sectors. The dotted lines, the green line is for nominal earnings index and the blue line is for real earnings index, and the dotted lines are for this hotels and restaurant sector. We noticed that there has been quite similar development during the last years, starting from the beginning of 2010s, and so that the development compared to all sectors and these sectors in these have been quite similar, and the one explanation to this is coordination. So what are important when we look at the inequality outcomes in the sector? So wage negotiated in this sector, which is somewhat exceptional, is that wages are only negotiated at the nationwide sectoral negotiations. There's no negotiation of wages at the local company level. So, so one might say that current collective bargaining system with minimum wages and high collective agreement coverage has prevented increase in the wage inequality in the sector. And the role of these is highlighted both by the employer and employee side organizations in this industry. But one of the problems in the sector is that there's a combination of low pay and part-time work. And it has increased the problems to cope with the wage. And one solution would be to offer more full-time work instead of part-time work. And also the service union in Finland has suggested that there should be some changes in the legislation, giving motivations. like regulating more the use of part-time work. So going to this pattern bargaining, on the one hand side, it has caused that wage increases in different industries have been similar level, because usually the wage norm, the minimum, the upper norm is also the minimum norm, so that it has been a good thing for unions with less bargaining power, like hotels and restaurants. On the other hand, it's difficult to get higher wage increases and improve relative wages for the other groups if there is this kind of wage coordination. And the social partners in this sector say that there is no need for national minimum wages because sector-specific minimum wages are regarded better. Oh, sorry, I just forgot to change the, yes. Go. And going to the conclusions, so in Finland, collective bargaining is an essential part of the labor market. And what is important is that from inequality perspective, is that collective agreements define the minimum level for the terms and conditions of employment. And at the company level, it's always possible to agree on better terms. But the model in Finland is in a state of flux. There is need for consensus for the pattern bargaining model. The social partners see that pattern bargaining is a good thing because we get coordination and improve competitiveness and safeguard competitiveness, but the model should be more flexible than the current model. And the current bargaining system with nationwide collective agreements setting the minimum conditions for wage increases and other conditions, and the high coverage rates, which is very important, play an important role for fair wages and working conditions, more equal earnings dispersion and smaller income differentials. And the low-pay sectors such as hotels and restaurants have also benefited from the bargaining model in Finland. It has created more common rules and promoted thus equality. Common rules are especially important in low-pay sectors and sectors which have very scattered and fragmented membership, such as this sector. So thank you.
All right, and now we will be moving on to the Lithuanian presentation. So please, Inga.
Hello, my name is Inga Blažienė. I am sorry, but I probably will not be able to say everything in few minutes. So I will try just to say some main points, and I also would like to share, to give a few minutes to my colleagues to our social partners who represent manufacturing trade unions from Lithuania. So, okay, how it goes? Yeah, you know that overall environment in Lithuania in collective bargaining is rather poor, not in favor of collective bargaining, and there is absence of collective bargaining culture, and we have relatively weak trade unions. Weak, I mean that density is low, you know, and some financial and human capacities are also not very, are rather limited. Many trade unions comes from the public sector, but in the private sector there is not much bargaining, only in some companies, and also employers' organizations try not to assume obligations at sectoral or national levels, and actually we have very strict legislation that leaves little space for bargaining, and as a result of all this is rather low collective bargaining coverage. Recently, during 4 years, we have rather a significant increase because due to collective bargaining coverage in the public sector, and we have sectoral agreements in the public sector, but in the private sector it remains rather low. Wage bargaining, yes, it takes place at national level. We have a rather strong institution, tripartite council, and it is rarely plays an important role in setting minimum wage with impacts later and average wage and also inequality. At sectoral level, situation is very different because in the private sector, we have actually only one collective sectoral agreement signed in 2019, and actually there is no wage bargaining at sectoral level. And in the public sector, during recent years, we have some collective agreements also covering some remuneration related issues in education and healthcare, social care, some other public sectors. And in company level, again, in companies where with trade unions, there is actually almost always collective bargaining takes place and wages are bargained and negotiated, but actually it happens only in a small part of private sector companies. And in the public sector, as I said, there is a lot of strict regulations, and there is again little space for bargaining at for wages in the public sector. I tried to look, of course, when you look at Lithuania, just compare with other countries, you can see that we have, yes, we have, together with other countries in the cluster, we have one of the highest inequalities and one of the lowest bargaining coverage. And of course, you can stick those two things and say that yes, probably it has impact on, there is an impact relation between collective bargaining and inequality. But when you try to look at what is happening and which features of collective bargaining, of which facts have impact on inequality, you can see that sometimes collective bargaining can decrease inequality, but maybe in some times it could even a little bit increase, I don't know. So I just put here some examples that, of course, that there is no big influence because labor legislation plays the most important role, not collective bargaining. Also, the most sectors with the lowest wages and with the lowest share of low-paid employees, like hotels and restaurants or retail trade, we do not have neither collective agreements nor trade unions representing interests of these low-paid workers. And this probably do not, decrease inequality. And also we have such a norm in our legislation that collective agreements may apply to trade union members, and in the public sector, this norm is really often applied, and as a result, we have rather positive developments because we had some decrease in union membership after these norms started to apply. But from another side, you can see that you can think that probably. I know that in some institutions, in social care sector, for example, there are in the same company people who make the same job, but one is trade union member and other is not trade union member. They receive different, let's say, wages or some other non-monetary benefits, and also it like somehow could increase inequality within the company, in the public sector. Of course, on the other hand, social dialogue plays an important role through this tripartite council because there is clear correlation between minimum wage increases and inequality decreases in Lithuania. And also, there is no doubt that the employees covered by collective agreements have receive higher wages and more reasonably set wages and are better protected. And also there is a real success in our public sector when during national and sectoral bargaining, trade unions, they really manage to increase salaries of public sector employees. We choose for analysis manufacturing sector not because it is the lowest paid sector, of course, but because in Lithuania there is almost one or one of not many sectors where real collective wage bargaining takes place. And okay, I maybe skip some things because what else? Yeah, we do not have sectoral collective agreement in the whole manufacturing sector, but in the company level, collective bargaining takes place and wages are bargained. Usually, they collective agreements have such a wage annexes covering entire payroll system, and also in manufacturing sector, collective agreements apply to all employees. And yeah, and what else? Maybe some few that we do not have some wage segregation by workers in their age or gender, and seniority remains a matter of debate by all social partners. And yeah, maybe some about future expectations that what is necessary for the sector. They are thinking about development of sectoral collective bargaining, some increase in pay transparency, and some increase in union density and bargaining capacities. And 1 minute I give to okay, to my colleague.
Just a short perspective from trade unions. So we find that progressive companies with strong collective bargaining power not only improve their workers' conditions and pay levels, but also encourage other companies to review their pay practices in order to be competitive in a local scale. So this is very important in solving the problem of inequality between the central and periphery regions of Lithuania, which is a very relevant problem. In other words, one company with a strong social dialogue and social responsibility, by becoming a good example, can raise the living of the entire region and bring the income level of employees in remote regions closer to the wages of the ones in leading regions. So, so yes, therefore, it can be said that collective bargaining is likely is one of the catalysts for reducing inequality and enhancing the level of living conditions of residents in the regions. So in our work, trade union work, we see concrete examples in industry sector, and we are happy for that. And just briefly, I will not take more time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a very valuable input on the Lithuanian case. And then last but not least, I would like to welcome the Spanish colleagues to the floor.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Jesus Cruces. I came from Fundación Primero de Mayo. First of all, I would like to thank you, our colleagues, Sam, Caroline, and the colleagues from the SEPs, for organizing this final conference and all the work that we have done together. It has been a pleasure to be in this project. And the first of my foundation is, in a quick comment, is linked to one of the biggest trade unions in Spain, Comisiones Obreras. That's a situation, a context. I will try to be on time. Everything that I'm going to present is in the report. There are many data and many references, so you have the report just to have a look. And I go further. The presentation is focused on how wages are set in the wage bargaining model in Spain, and which is one of the part of the report. And the second part, we have focused on one of the sector, the long-term sector. It has been interesting to analyze this sector. First, because it's a different sector of the rest of the project. That's a clue. There's another thing, that's a strong relationship between collective bargaining and social dialogue in terms of wage determination. That's the main idea, because long-term sector is very related to public administrations, so there is a strong relationship between those both elements. Talking about collective bargaining and wages, I'm going to start talking about which is the link between labor institution and economic growth. There has been said a lot of things about that. Andrea has talked a little bit on this issue, but obviously from the euro crisis, and in Spain is a good example of this. Many measures were taken in terms of devaluating wages as a way of taking out of the crisis. And after that, we had an interesting debate about what is an inclusive growth. And here we have all the institutions talking about inclusive growth. But they talk about many factors like technical elements, education, and so on. There are many factors in this literature. But what about labor institutions? And after this period, we can start finding some literature that focus on these missing links of the inclusive growth. That means, what is the role of collective bargaining in the economic growth? That's the question. And we have, from this point, we have had two big points, which is the COVID crisis, and then the actual debate on minimum wage and inflation. And what point is that collective bargaining and minimum wage, they have a essential role in the economic growth. That's the main argument. For example, in Spain, I'm not talking a lot of this on this, but for example, in Spain, there has been a strong social dialogue in terms of job scheme, maintaining the employment, and a strong social dialogue on minimum wage, and also we have at least recovered the main elements of the collective bargaining in terms of wage setting. There is still a little bit elements that has to be recovered from the last reform on the euro crisis, but we are on the path of putting the collective bargaining in the place of what it has to be in this inclusive growth. And obviously, the debate of minimum wage, which is this in Europe. In Spain, we have to say that it has been a strong increase on minimum wage. We has been at the tripartite social dialogue. Sometimes employers don't want to be on the table, but it's on the social dialogue. Talking about the objective of the project, we have already said before, just to know how wages are set, how wages are defined in collective bargaining. Here we have, as the other projects, we have followed the same issues. Talking about the wage, we have to say that in Spain, most of the wages are set at the collective bargaining wages. Collective bargaining, we have a coverage of nearly 80%, and which is regulated the base salary and the wage structure. Our model is based on the effective model as other countries, and at the sector level, sector bargaining level. That means, and these are the two main elements that explain this high coverage. It's true that, for example, in the euro crisis, one of the modifications was the ultra-activity element, that it was recovered by the social partners and specific bipartite agreement. It was, if we think, we compare to other countries, for example, with Portugal, because, for example, in Portugal, they lose the extension mechanisms in the crisis, but they recover by the law. And in Spain, this resilience was made by the social partner instead of the law. We have an intersectoral collective agreement. At this time, it was agreed very recently. It has been agreed on different increases for the next years, and with guarantee clauses in terms if prices are higher than the expected increase. Negotiator has to arrange new agreements. In terms of the clauses of wage increases, most of them, they make reference to the prices, the CPI. There's also other formulas, but the main one is this one. And the sectoral level plays a central role. I mean, at company level, they can arrange more wage increases, but the sector level is the. If we have a look at the data, and you can find it in the report, more or less in the last decades, the agri wages are on the same line as prices. It's like a moderation tendency, dynamics. And very recently, the last agreement is recovering part of the purchasing power that has been lost in the last decades. We have to say that there's still a lot of gap of the purchasing power that has been lost in the last decade, but still they are gaining a little bit more. This data is for the private sector. I have to say, Richard, this data is for the private sector, but still in the public sector there are also agreements, and it has a little bit specific elements, but still there is a strong collective bargaining at the administration. Talking about the sector activity, we have to say that collective bargaining covers the more organized and the greater unionized sector. We have to say that those sectors less organized and with less trade union presence, the main wage reference is the minimum wage. That's why, if we look in the report, we have specific data on how minimum wage affect different population. And we have found that the minimum wage increases in the last increases have affected most to the precarious employment, to women, to temporary contract, to young people, and so on. That's that sector that are not covered by the collective bargaining structure. And we have to say that sector social dialogue has been a central element on those recent years. For example, in the COVID period, in terms of the agreement that have been done in the labor and social issue, for example, in terms of employment, minimum wage, and also the rider sector, the gray zone, it has been, during the COVID, a strong, one of the main laws by the last employment minister, but it has been a lot of regulation on employment, focus on quality of the employment, wages, and employment conditions in general. It has been interesting what Andrea has said before concerning the employers, the relationship between the coverage of collective bargaining and employers' representative. Because it's true, when you have a strong social partner, both sides, not only union, you have to be to have the other side, the representatives of the employer has to be, because collective bargaining covers more and more people. It's a factor that has to be in fact. In terms of social dialogue, the position in the COVID period has been social panel have participated a lot. At the end of the COVID, employers didn't want to, for example, see the last minimum wage increases that has been signed between government and trade union, but in the new round, they are in this. And now, Luis is going to continue the presentation. I don't know how much time we have, 2 minutes, so.
Okay, just briefly and broadly speaking about the sector. Why we choose this sector is a sector with low wages and also with a lot degree of precariousness. There is a lot of the high degree of the workforce are women with also migrant and with medium and high age. So it's a specific collective people. And most of the, just as Jesus said before, there are different interests in the sector. We show different interest by the business employer association side and also by the trade union side. There were different organizations in both aspects, and so there were different interests in the tables. Also, we saw the interaction between tripartite social dialogue and collective bargaining, and also the effect of the legal minimum wage in the sector. At the tripartite social dialogue, they set the quality of the conditions in the sector, mainly because there is the huge importance of the public investment in the sector, and also because they set the ratios between workers and users or people who demands this kind of services. A special issue in this sector is that the quality of the sector is set in the public sphere, and also the rights are set in the public sector. But the services are offered mostly by the private sector. So there is a link between the public decisions and the private companies. So the strategies are different in the table. So the unions try to to increase the wages, to increase the quality of the working conditions, but employers said that there are public contracts. They sometimes are difficult to improve the wages and the conditions, but this the side of the tripartite social dialogue at state level, but also at the regional level. So we saw the interaction between the different levels, state level and regional level. And also in this, we saw the state collective agreement, guarantee clauses about wage clauses, and there is an interaction between the consumer price index and also with the GDP. So sometimes the clauses are fixed by both indicators. And just to give the floor to Jesus to the conclusion of the.
Yes, quick thing, if I'm in time, just 5 elements. Talking about inequality, we are talking about 3 issues. We have collective bargaining, we have minimum wage, and we have employment. And in Spain, in the last labor reform has been a path, for example, in employment, a high reduction in temporary employment. We have already have, which means better employment, more quality. But there are still three different issues that have been to be addressed. For example, in terms of inflation and purchasing power, that's one of the main issues that social partner has to face. Then working time, it's an ongoing issue related to employment and quality, the quality of employment and the balance, work balance. Then the creation of employment in some sectors, the redundancy condition that has been a key point of the previous labor reform. We still have more path on them. And obviously, the extending the collective bargaining to those sectors, those gray workers, those gray sectors that are not covered by the collective bargaining. But in terms talking about the gray workers, Andrea, just a quick comment. I was thinking that it's not only platform workers, it's an ongoing issue because, for example, in Spain we have an industry, for example, the meat industry, that has externalized part of its activity and they put at a safe employment. So it's a traditional industry that has, in terms of economic and strategy, they just put in a gray zone many workers. But many things has to be done in terms of the reduction of inequality on collective bargaining, wages, minimum wage, and employment. Thank you.
Okay, so we have had our deep dive into our country cases, and I think there's a lot of food for thought also for the panel debate that's now coming up. So I would like to invite all our panelists to the floor, and we also have one panelist joining us online. So Christine Aumeijer-Pintar from Eurofound, she will join us online. The debate will be moderated by Wouter Zwijsen from ETY. We also have Yves Marx from University of Antwerp and Rudy Delarue from the National Labour Council of Belgium. So please have a seat. Kies jullie maar waar je wil zitten. Ik denk dat elk van jullie een microfoon heeft. Welke bij jou is daar? Daar plaatsje. Misschien kunnen we gewoon alle drie zetels inzetten.
Okay, and I can see Christine. That's perfect. Hi, good afternoon. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much to Sam and the people from HIVA and SEPS for organizing this and for putting this very interesting conference and workshop together. I am really pleased to be able to moderate this panel discussion, which I think will be very interesting, following up on all the discussions we had today. And there should be plenty of time for some debate and some discussion afterwards. So it just follows up from all the discussions we had today. And as we heard, collective bargaining can, when it works well, be a very important factor in labor market policy and social policy. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. And can lead to good wage outcomes, good wage settings, and better outcomes for vulnerable workers. Of course, this depends on the coverage rate, on the extent to which it's carried by people, and on the support that is also there within the country context, and that differs very much. And some of the debate we'll have today is about the role of the state and policymakers in, on the one hand, supporting collective bargaining processes, on the other hand, the extent to which support becomes meddling after a while. We saw Sam's picture of the bridge with the low normit, and so these are examples of some of the constraints that the state can put on the process of collective bargaining. And in that, there is some tension inherent sometimes, as we saw also in the minimum wage directive. To what extent does do you set a statutory minimum wage, and to what extent do you leave it all to the collective partners, to the social partners. And of course, in Europe, as we take European perspective, this is all made incredibly more complex by the fact that the systems are so very different in different countries. We saw some of the numbers today. It is just we were talking about comparing countries, like I think we just saw Lithuania, where 7 to 8% of people are covered, and then we contrast this to Belgium, where it's the vast majority, almost everyone essentially. It's difficult to find a common thread in this sort of topic, and yet difficult is also possible, so we will try. Let me first introduce briefly the panel, and then I will give each of the panelists about 5 to 7 minutes. Well, they will get 5 to 7 minutes to discuss just some general first thoughts on this whole issue of equality and collective bargaining, and policymakers versus the social partners. And then we will open up the floor to debate and discussion, also between the panelists and with the floor. So first we will have joining online, very kindly, and thank you very much for joining us, Christine Omar Pintar, which I probably mispronounced, but she can correct it in a moment. She's a senior research manager with Eurofound. She coordinates Eurofound's activity on industrial relations and social dialogue, and also manages the network of Eurofound correspondents. She's got many comparative employment and working condition related topics, and these are mainly on minimum wages, collective bargaining, and also gender pay transparency. She recently also coordinated a Herculean research project on collectively agreed minimum wage, which is very cool. And I look very much forward to hearing your thoughts. We will also have Eva Marx, who is a professor in social policy at the University of Antwerp, and a director of the Center of Social Policy, Herman de Leek, where he leads research on income and wealth inequality, labor markets, and migration, and is also a research fellow at IZA Bonn. He's in several editorial boards, such as for the Journal of Social Forces, Journal of Social Policy, and is part of the board of ESPANET, which collects researchers on social policy across Europe. He recently published also jointly with colleagues, of which at least one is there, a really interesting paper on the minimum wage directive, which I invite everyone to read through, because it's really encapsulating a lot of the topics we discuss now. And then finally, I'm very pleased that Rudy Delarue can join us, who is the president of the Belgian National Labour Council. So we've discussed the Belgian case a couple of times already. It came up, and it's very nice that we have an absolute expert, well, two absolute experts here. He also had a very illustrious international career, being deputy head of unit for international issues, senior expert at DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion at the European Commission, director of the ILO office for the EU and Benelux countries, and has origins as well in the Belgian Christian Trade Union Confederation, where he worked and published extensively on several of these topics we'll discuss today. So with these introductions out of the way, let's start the debate, because I know the whole timekeeping is relatively tight as it is. So Christine, I give you the floor for about 5 to 7 minutes.
Thank you, Wouter, and thank you for the organizers to invite me and to allow this hybrid participation, which simplifies my life as much as I would have loved to be with you today and to join the networking dinner afterwards. Also very pleased to see that 3 correspondents of our network of correspondents have been part of that research project. And partially the things that I'm going to present today is also based on their work. So Wouter, I wanted to briefly dwell on the first 2 questions that you posed to us panelists. And the first is, to what extent is tackling income inequality and ensuring a fair minimum wages in the hands of policymakers or social partners, or both? And I would say, you know, this is really not a simple question that you can answer with a yes or no, and this one or that one. It's so normative. And it really depends on the type of system that you have in place at the moment in the specific countries. And you alluded to the diversity that we have in Europe. I think the first question you have asked and we have to ask ourselves is to what extent these systems have a collective bargaining that can actually achieve an impact on wage equality, because not every system does that at the moment. And if it doesn't, what's then the role of policymakers, the legislator, to correct this and to further redistribute? But also at this level, and we saw this in the case of Lithuania, for example, even in the absence of a collective, a functioning collective bargaining, wage bargaining system, you do have another role to involve the social partners, and that is then at tripartite level in policy making via the statutory minimum wages, but also in the all other areas that can work in a redistributive way. I'd say also the other question is to what extent are income inequalities then driven by wage inequalities, or to what extent do other factors come into play? And I'm referring now to research that has been done by Eurofound colleagues Carlos Vacas and Enrique Macias, the first time, I think, in 2017, reviewing data, looking back at the time of the Great Recession. And they looked at the income distribution across the whole EU and found out that at that time, this growing income inequality was really much more a matter of growing unemployment across the EU and in specific countries as a consequence of the Great Recession. So much more than wage inequalities. And very recently, they went back to redo this research, Carlos Vacas, and he found that with the new crisis, so the pandemic, the situation has greatly changed. And so now, if we see rising inequalities, it is more driven by wage inequalities, whereas the effect of growing unemployment has really been limited. And I've heard this argument also today in one of the presentations. The success stories that we see across the EU of governments becoming better by and large, not everywhere, of course, but becoming better in involving the social partners in designing the relevant policies to address unemployment as a consequence of COVID in this regard. So all the short-time working schemes that we saw, but also all the income replacement schemes, and they obviously helped to reduce the impact on inequality by and large. But this also means now that wage inequalities are coming more back to the fore and into the focus. And this brings me already to your second question, Wouter, asking what is it, which choices can the social partners make that affect the wage inequalities and income inequalities? But let's look at wage inequalities first. And well, we've heard a lot about collective bargaining coverage today already in Andreas, starting with Andreas' excellent speech in the morning, and about coordination. And I will try to give a little bit of information stemming from our most recent research project that tried to have a deeper look into collective agreements and taking collective agreements related to low-paid workers. But before I do, I also wanted to comment briefly on coordination and the fact that it has been mentioned today that we have very different types of coordination going on across the member states that have coordination mechanism in place. So we heard about the Belgium wage setting mechanism with the wage norm, which kind of limits the amount that the sectors can agree on. We've heard about the Finnish model, which has a similar mechanism where the technology industry sets the limit for wage negotiations for other sectors. A counterexample, and this is one which shows that coordination is not always beneficial. A counterexample is from my own country, Austria, which is also said to have a very good sectoral coordination between the social partners, but very often it is the metalworking sector that has the highest increases, and all the other low-paid sectors, follow the development, but they wouldn't follow the level. So over time, what you can see is an increasing divergence in pay, in negotiated pay across the different sectors, with the effect that low-paid sectors, female-dominated sectors, tend to, not to be able to catch up with wage developments in the pattern-setting sector. So this obviously then has a knock-on effect on other forms of inequalities that we can observe, the gender pay gap notably. And this is obviously something we can then debate later, what possibilities obviously social partners would have within their collective agreements to address this. I mean, a different form of coordination across sectoral levels is one thing. The other thing is obviously to look into the collective agreement and to see how are the wage scales defined, but this is already then within the sector, and to what extent is female dominated work um, also valued the same as male dominated work if it is based on the degree of responsibility, autonomy, complexity, etc. So it really requires a detailed look into how wage scales are structured in collective agreements. And talking about how wages are structured in collective agreement, I wanted to share with you very briefly this screen here and these findings of the project that I've mentioned before. Can you see my slide? I think you should be able to see that now. So in this project, we, with our correspondents, we took collective agreements in relation to low-paid sectors, and we coded the wage rates, the lowest rate that we could find in a collective agreement and the highest rate in nearly 700 collective agreements. And what you can see is that countries really differ, but also collective agreements within countries differ in the way how much up the wage scale they regulate the pay of workers. So some countries have the managerial works into the collective agreements, have their pay set in these agreements. Other countries just simply put a minimum wage rate. And obviously, so this is really a composition of two effects here. But what the point that I wanted to make is that if you want, as a social partners, to influence the whole wage distribution somehow, it really depends how far up the wage scale you regulate the pay of workers. And the other finding we have from this project, also looking into this wage scale, is to what extent are they structured based on specific criteria. And also there's a huge difference between collective agreements and countries in general, with some countries having a much higher share of resorting to professional delineations and seniority-based delineations, while others have more newer forms which differentiate the pay of workers by skills, complexity, responsibility, autonomy, which I would argue are more conducive to ensuring that there is a work of equal value principle embedded, and thus helping maybe to address some of the inequalities that we can see on a personal level. And I'm stopping the sharing right now. But this brings me to my last point, seniority. I've heard that as well today. Seniority is certainly also an aspect in collective agreements, widely used as we saw, but that can have an impact on inequalities. I mean, per se, seniority is a relatively objective measure, but it really depends on how it's implemented into the collective agreements. Because especially when you are thinking of a workforce that can be relatively mobile, switching jobs very often, and if seniority in collective agreement means that you lose out your seniority every time you change employer, then this has a detrimental effect on a certain part of the workforce, increasing inequalities. So what social partners in the collective agreement can and should be doing is to look at how can seniority be valued even across employers, or even if you change across sectors. And I think I stopped my intervention here because I've talked too much, but I keep some points for later. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was slightly over time, but it was also very interesting, so thank you very much for that. I think the takeaway I take from this is, of course, there's a lot, but first of all, that there's the complexity, even if we're just talking about wages. It's not just the minimum wages, which we've been discussing a lot about now, but it's, of course, wages without distribution, seniority as well, and who is covered, who is not. And then also the fact, I think Sam already hinted at this, that, of course, there's a collective bargaining about wages, but the higher, what you said, Sam, is that the higher up the level you kind of go, to the sectoral, to the national level, more and more factors are taken on board as well, like what you mentioned, the unemployment, which of course, if we're talking about inequality, it's also about people who are not getting a wage. There is the difference between income inequality, wage inequality. And anyway, a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much for the intervention. I will now ask Eva to intervene for a bit. Also on this wider topic of equality, collective bargaining, and who should set it.
So thank you, Walter. I think you asked me for kind of a first reaction or a first thought. So my first reaction and first thought here is one of delight, I should say. And why is that? Because this project and the fact that we're having this panel is part of what you could call the big revival in research into collective bargaining. It has always struck me how little research there was in collective bargaining for a long time. Yeah, so as Andrea pointed out, there was a conference in Driffill more than 30 years ago almost. Then there was a big search, and then it kind of died down. And then for a long time, while there was a big surge in interest in inequality, and I remember 10 years ago, I was presenting the results of the Gini project. That was a big European project we did on inequality in Europe. And I remember as we were doing that project, there were a lot of people involved there, that there was very few people working, and there was indeed very little research on how unions, how collective bargaining and all of that mattered for inequality. There was a very nice chapter in 2004 in the OECD Employment Outlook that looked at the impact of collective bargaining, but there was overall very little research. So I'm happy to see that kind of resurgence there is. You're part of that, and of course Andrea and this project is part of that. Eurofound is doing great work, and I think you can also, it's good, but it's also long overdue. Because if you think, I mean, perhaps one big factor that plays a role here is the minimum wage directive. And usually it is the case that research is running ahead of policy. I think about what happened with minimum wages. You know, after Carter and Kruger, there was this big surge in research into minimum wages and the employment effects of minimum wages. Massive amount of research which showed, that it is complicated. It's not simply higher minimum wages, less employment. It is far more complicated. And that, I think, that research was very instrumental, was very important in many European countries introducing and increasing minimum wages. Not in the least in the case of Germany, where after a contentious debate, the minimum wage was introduced in 2015, and that research, I think, played an important role there. But now we are in a bit of a reverse situation. We have the minimum wage directive, which is very ambitious, and it's only now that all that research is happening into the question like 80% collective bargaining coverage and 60% of the median wage. Is that actually a good idea? Is that feasible? So it's good that this research is happening, and it's a bit and it's overdue. So that's the good thing. And just to emphasize, I mean, perhaps to emphasize one thing. Of course, we know that collective bargaining matters a lot for inequality. It also matters a lot for poverty, which I think is by far the most problematic part of inequality. I don't worry too much about what is happening with the Gini, to be honest, especially after the Gini project, where we looked at what are the consequences of it. It's very hard. If the Gini rises with 2 points, it doesn't matter that much, I think. But of course, poverty matters a lot. And it is important to be aware how important collective bargaining, because collective bargaining directly affects, of course, wage outcomes. and affect wage floors. And I think there's a tendency to think about the impact collective bargaining on wages, that matters most for people who are in work, for the so-called working poor, which is a relatively small part of the overall poor population. But it's also important to keep in mind how much wage floors matters for the rest of the population, also for those who are not in work, simply because we know that the level of the benefit or the potential level of benefits you can provide to people who are unemployed and people who are sick and people who are on social assistance depends very much on the level of the wage floor, simply because it is a simple political principle that work has to pay more than living on a benefit. Of course, policymakers are concerned about work incentives. So wage floors, and that's also work we're doing right now, wage floors do not only matter for that relatively small segment of the population working for a low wage and being at risk of being working poor. It effectively matters for all the rest. It matters a lot for the benefits you can provide to people who are not in work. So it is very, very important to understand what social partners, what social dialogue, what collective bargaining is doing for wage floors. And of course, we have to move there beyond what is a relationship with collective bargaining coverage or with union density, but also how does the kind of collective bargaining that is going on, so to what extent it is centralized, and so exactly how collective bargaining takes place, how that affects wage outcomes and wage floors. I think we still have there are still important gaps to be filled there. And I also think I'll conclude there. So also, I think we need more research now in the other direction. So we know that in many countries, there's been an expansion in work benefits. Because of course, there is a concern with that. And for a long time, there's been a concern. We need to get people into work. Activation policies and the third way and all of that was all about that. And so we've seen a big expansion in so-called in-work benefits of various sources through the tax system, but also reductions in social security contributions and so on. And an interesting question is, so how is this affecting collective bargaining? And how is this affecting wages? Because there is a couple of standard arguments there that if you provide in-work benefits and you have in-work benefits, of course, that reduces the pressure on employers to pay higher wages. It also reduces the pressure to some extent on unions to bargain for higher wages. So what the impact is as it were of in the other direction, how what is happening in the political sphere is affecting collective bargaining. That's I think another very important issue to look at.
Thank you very much for that. I think these are really important points. So indeed, with the expansion of the in-work benefits, it kind of goes to the way how policymakers and political agendas affect the whole wage setting procedures as well. And then I think I can only agree with you that research here is somewhat lagging behind. I know we were talking with colleagues as well. There's these action plans that will have to be set for countries that don't make the 80% guideline threshold. I'm going to use the neutral term because indeed it's not an aim. But now we have to think what has to be in those action plans. And it's not so straightforward because there's not one book of recipes of how we can improve collective bargaining, which I think this is really the moment to make an impact, but it's not, we're slightly behind. Now, of course, projects like this can help make that up to some extent. So thank you very much for that intervention, and also for the focus again on why we should look at the wage floors, where indeed it has the spillover effects to the rest of society. And even though the group of working poor is not big, they shouldn't even be there to start with. So thank you very much. And now I'm very happy to give the word to Rudy for his intervention on this topic. And then we can open the floor to debate. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I agree with Yves that it is very much welcome that there is new attention to research on collective bargaining, wages, minimum wage, and so on. The knowledge is, for the moment, not very well developed, so I very much welcome these initiatives, which are, of course, also partly related to the fact that there is a new EU directive, and the EU has sufficient, of course, financial resources to organize networks all over Europe for research. In Belgium, until recently, it was quite limited. This is also reflected in the general media, not in the specialized media, but in the general media, there is a total lack of knowledge on collective agreements, collective bargaining. The sector dimension is only mentioned when there is a conflict, but not when there are many, many agreements. So the press tends to focus on the conflict and not on the solutions, and the solutions are there at sector level, company level, or even sometimes at national level. So I very much welcome this. Now, as you know, in the Belgian system, and I'm chair of the National Labour Council, the minimum wages are determined by collective agreement. We have a bottom-up system that is not very well known, meaning that historically, we first looked at the sectors. So the sectors introduced sector minimum wages in the 60s, 70s. And then in 73, social partners discovered that too many workers and employers were not covered by sectors. And so they agreed at that time to conclude a national minimum wage. This has been then increased in 3 waves, and the last wave is now. So it's a quite important part of my workload is to implement and to follow up the package deal that has been made in 21 between the top social partners to increase between 2022 and 2026 by different steps the minimum wage, and also later on as from 28. But that's not legally organized at this time. This is only commitment to look. But I think the important part is that you need a broad coverage, and that's a big concern I have with some of the member states. I have worked many years in the European Commission, and the reason why, and we have to go back to the 90s for this, the reason why some of the member states that joined the EU in 2004 have very fragmented collective bargaining systems is very simple. I mean, the European Commission had no know-how on these issues. I think there were a few people in the entire European Commission that had knowledge on this. And so it was outsourced to the World Bank. And the World Bank at that time, they were focusing on individual issues. I mean, individual contracts, individual pension rights, and so on. So this explains partly why in some of the new member states at that time, collective bargaining systems are very weak. I was witnessing this. I have criticized very much as European Commission the World Bank at that time. We had very confrontational meetings as from 2000. We indicated that they had serious mistakes in their approaches. But of course, I mean, this only gradually changed. So I'm very happy now that the European Commission was able to present a directive and that it was finally adopted. So what do we need now? We need, of course, to strengthen the collective bargaining systems. If there is a weak institutional framework, we should improve it, I think. And if this is not possible, then of course you need, in one way or another, the legislator to intervene through a tripartite commission like we have in Germany, like we have in other member states. There is no other alternative, I think. But then on the question, what about social partners with the authorities? Who should take the lead? Well, my position is that it should go hand in hand. So pre- and redistribution should go hand in hand. It makes no sense to increase the minimum wage and then tax away by social security or general taxation the increase. I mean, this is not something personal. I mean, this is, you can find this guidance in the ILO frameworks. There is an ILO guidance book on this, available as since 2016. You can find it in the ILO conventions. You can find it in the OECD guidelines. You find it also in the European Commission guidance. So you have to work together. It makes no sense to focus only on the contractual dimension of a minimum wage if you do not, as social partners, discuss this with the authorities in order to take into account the fiscal and parafiscal dimension. And also the broader social policies. I mean, if you have a minimum wage of 16 euros an hour and you have to pay for the school of your children, then it's better to have 12 euros an hour and that the school is free for your children. The same goes for health issues. If you have 17 euros an hour as a minimum wage, but you have to pay your health insurance yourself, and you have a problem, you have to pay it out of the pocket, I mean, then you are better off with a minimum wage of 12 euro and a coverage of social security. So you have to see this in the general framework of poverty measures, of course, as well. Maybe on a last point, in the Belgian system, the minimum wage is only applicable to 3% of the workforce. Why? There are two reasons. First, there is a lot of work that is not well known by the sector social partners to adapt, let's say, their coverage. I mean, there is a lot of work going to look to new activities, and they say, is this activity something we have to cover, and how can we cover it? That's not very well known. Very few people know this. And then the second reason is, of course, that we have the system of general applicable collective agreements, erga omnes, these two together. But as I think also Yves said, the minimum wage is also important for social security because many of the benefits are linked to the general development of minimum wages. In Belgium, that's something I forgot to say, the minimum wage by collective agreement includes a clause on indexation. So there is an automatic indexation in the collective agreement. It's also a problem sometimes in the press because they say this should be abolished. Yeah, okay, but if you abolish this, you intervene in the collective agreement. So all the links to indexation are related to clauses in the collective agreements. So if you want to abolish this or change, you have to realize that you affect the collective agreement, which is protected by international law as well. I stop here.
Thank you very much for that. I think it's also important to realize again that these are not necessarily simple issues, which you also highlighted with the understanding of media and the way it's discussed. So that could be partly enthusiasm about the system, but it could also partly be because it's just not that simple. And of course, then talking about just increasing collective bargaining and setting a minimum wage simplifies it to a certain extent. The question is how good that is in the end. So thank you, all three of you, very much for your interventions. I suggest that now, in the also with time in mind, I open the floor for debate and questions, and of course also the panelists themselves can ask questions to each other if they want. So are there any questions from the floor that I can collect? Should I go around or? Oh, okay. So there, the man in the back, and then hands are popping up all over. In the back was first.
Hello, I'm Nishant, and I've come from Euroclear. It's a clearing and settlement firm in Brussels Nord. So my question is around stakeholder revolution or approach that is being followed by private equity firms like KKR already in the United States. So is that something that EU policymakers will consider as well?
I don't understand the question completely. I'm very sorry.
Okay, so there is a new approach being employed by financial firms like private equity firms like KKR. So they are employing a stakeholder approach in which everyone, including the suppliers, as well as their employees, are being given a voice in collective bargaining and setting the minimum wage or floor for their remuneration. So is that something EU policymakers are going to consider? Is it clear now?
I think it's clear. So across the whole value chain.
Yeah. Yep.
But still at the firm level. But shall we collect some other questions first and then go through the panel to see if they?
Thank you.
Or how would you like to prefer? Christine, do you want to respond? Go ahead, please.
So I mean, I can briefly answer. To be honest, I haven't heard determined that concept as such yet with the voice and including these stakeholders. But a quick thought that I had is that the minimum wage directive does include an article on public procurement, and I think this also extends to so that when governments are doing a public procurement, they have to make sure that their suppliers are adhering to the minimum wage, collectively agreed or statutory. And to my knowledge, this also extends to the supply chain. And there's also public procurement laws, which I'm, not fully familiar with in the EU, but I dare say that the whole supply chain is included in that. Though I haven't really heard about this voice element that you mentioned. So thank you for this idea, and probably other people might know more in the room than I do about this. Thank you.
Thank you indeed for the question, and thank you for responding to it. Does anyone else want to intervene on that, or? Okay.
Yeah, hello, Richard Pond from the EPSA, the Public Service Federation. Actually, my question is more generally about collective bargaining and the challenges to increase it. And I mean, one of the things really is, particularly in Eastern Europe, is that to get to sector bargaining, I mean, very often the unions are there, but the employers aren't. And it's how to get, first of all, how to ensure that there are employer organisations there to negotiate with, and then to convince them that it's a good idea. And that's something that we're looking at with some of our sector organisations at European level, but maybe that's also, perhaps the focus of research should be shifted towards that, to get the employers on board and to see to what extent, some of the arguments should be broadened across Europe to say there are some benefits for employers as well. I suppose my only fear is that at the moment, the European level employers like Business Europe don't seem to be particularly interested in social dialogue or collective bargaining.
Thank you very much for that point. I think it really echoes what came up a lot in the discussion, namely that you do need the two parties, and that the employer associations as well are very important, and we should discuss them more.
Yeah, it's Jesus Cruces from Fundación Primero de Mayo. Just two quick question and comments. Yeah, I agree with if it's this and a new debate on collective bargaining, and I presume like in-work benefits are, and the relations between in-work benefits and wages is an open debate. But the question is, how do you evaluate the possible impact in the debate of the reduction of working hours, and how collective bargaining could face this and with wages and the debate of wages. So I think working time and wages within collective bargaining are central issues. So that's the first question, how to relate both things. And the second comment is on poverty and minimum wages. Obviously, if we look at the poverty threshold, there's a strong relationship between minimum wage. The fact is, in Spain, as Richard said, employers not all the times are in favor of sitting on the table and have a tripartite social dialogue. For example, in the last two rounds, they were not signing any agreement. And now they are sitting on the table, but they are proposing only the prices increase, but the trade unions are saying, we have reached the social chart, the 60% of the median, and we are pushing to this level. In your experience, what is the level, the reference that has to be taken in order to have these poverty rate reductions? Because, as you said, it's very linked to the social benefits. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Shall we answer these two questions, maybe already three questions? So this is about one, how it's about how we get to this higher coverage rate, and specifically by getting employers on board where there's not such organization in employers' organizations. And then secondly, if I understood your questions correctly, it's about one, going beyond wages to these new discussions on working time. Well, new to these ongoing discussions on working time, and what to do with that while keeping wages constant. And I know in Belgium we had a solution that our unions are not super happy with, as far as I understand. The 4-day week, that is not actually a 4-day week, but just compressing all the wages, all the hours. And I know there's many other countries that are experimenting with different forms. And then regarding the issue of poverty and setting these minimum standards, to what extent the collective partners should do that, right? And, so I invite the panel to respond to these issues. Shall we first start with Eva, then Rudy, and then Christine too?
Well, I think I'll address the latter point first. Yeah, well, that on the minimum wage and poverty. So I think it's important to keep in mind that if we look at the present state of minimum wages in Europe, so a lot of my work has been on the working poor and so what can policy do, and inevitably or invariably the policy debate about what can we do for the so-called working poor, which is still a very important group, tends to focus on what should be the role of the minimum wage. I think it's very important to keep in mind that while minimum wages are obviously very important, that if we care about people who are working poor, minimum wages alone, no matter how high you set them, will never do the job alone. There will always be a role for the state in supplementing the incomes of people who are low paid. So if you look at the current level of the minimum wages in Europe relative to the poverty threshold, you see that actually in many countries minimum wages now are above or even way above the poverty threshold for a single person who works full time. But of course the situation changes if you look at people who are single parents and who have more mouths to feed and have to make ends meet on a sole minimum wage. There's at present in Europe not a single country where the minimum wage in itself is high enough to lift a full-time working single parent above the poverty threshold. Meaning that there is a crucial role for policy, not only to make sure that these people are not too highly taxed, but also that they get the income supplements they need, for example, in the form of child benefits and other kinds, and housing supplements and all kinds of other income supplements that exist, to make sure that they can escape poverty. Yeah, so it's important to keep in mind that minimum wages have a very important, or wage floors more in general have an important role to play, but that's not can never be the whole solution.
Thank you very much. Rudy?
Well, I agree. I said more or less the same 10 minutes ago. I agree on what Yves is saying on this. On the employers' organizations, I fully agree. It's very important to have employers at the table. We have in Belgium a fortunate situation that employers are very well organized. They are organized primarily at sector level, and then they join the confederation of the Belgian employers. We have the same for some small and medium-sized companies. You have a separate organization. And then at regional level, that's another story. It's much more complicated because at Flemish level, for instance, the organization of companies, it's not employers, is more organized according to Chambre de Commerce, which is not the same as an employer. But I fully agree, there should be more investment in the business case of social dialogue. I think the Commission made a mistake in the 90s, early 2000, with enlargement, that they overlooked this issue at the time. also the European Parliament. I remember in managing social dialogue projects that suddenly the Parliament decided that maximum 10% of the social dialogue budget of the EU could go to new member states. I mean, I was really astonished. I mean, that was so stupid, I'm sorry. They should have provided 90% instead of 10%. So that's a long-term issue, and I think that the EU should invest in this again, together with the employers. To give you an example, who is doing the training for employers' federations on social dialogue? It's the ILO. Huh? It's the training center in Turin, which is fine, but it's a smart program. So I agree. On the issue of working time, well, this is not new. Huh? I mean, my first collective agreement I was involved in was in '87, and that was the name of that collective agreement was New Systems of Working Time. So at the time in the 80s, you had already the idea of alternative schedules, working during the weekend, and then be paid full time. I mean, this is not so new. Then it faded away, and now it's again on the agenda, but not in the same intensity as in the 80s. We have now a national agreement on 38 hours as an average weekly working time. In some sectors it's 36, in some companies it's 35. Whether it will decrease further, that depends on the collective bargaining. But it's not so present anymore as in the 80s. In the 80s, really, it was the topic.
Thank you very much. Christine, can I ask you to respond if you have anything further to respond on this sort of working time and employers' organizations? Sorry, go.
So specifically to the employers organization, I think this is a highly relevant question that we will have to address in the next years to come if you're talking about how to improve collective bargaining coverage towards the 80%. Employers organizations, I think that there's a different pattern behind us with the unions. The unions had a decline in membership. Membership in employers organization, on the other hand, was relatively stable. And one reason why it was relatively stable was that they managed to provide other services to their members, and like all the trade related consulting, or payroll services, etc. So there's different examples that we've mapped in some reports that helped stabilize this membership, and this I think is on the one hand a very good basis. Because they're there. But the other question is how to get them into sector-related collective bargaining, where this is not a tradition. And there, I think we should look at the systems that are currently in place and that are still functioning well. How is the system defined that came to this result? And what I could, for instance, imagine is systems that do not allow employers, individual employers, to opt out from sectoral agreements, like this was the case in Germany, even though they are part of an employers' organizations. So to review these aspects of the systems and address this. I mean, the biggest incentives for employers to be in a sectoral collective agreement is to have this level playing field. Not to be faced with very low wages. But now in the context of increasing labor shortages, this is again an argument we have to reflect through. Is this still true and valid? Because there might not be a race to the bottom anymore. Now there might be more a race towards higher wages and getting the workforce. So maybe the level playing field of a collective agreement could come by restraining a little bit the wages, and that could be an incentive for employers to just thinking aloud. The other very very interesting thought I heard recently was in a recent conference that I attended, also from organized by HIFA, from Thorsten Schulten, and he suggested look at the Austrian system, the Austrian chamber system, which creates this 100% of collective bargaining coverage in the private sector because of this mandatory membership of companies. Now, I think this is super delicate for the social partners. We will never get there. But he was saying, in those countries where such chambers already existed, is there anything that we could incentivize them to come up with such a chamber system? And he was referring to Germany. I mean, to be honest, I also think that this is completely going against the autonomy of social partners, but I thought it was an interesting thought. So, so much for the employers. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That is indeed a really interesting point as well to think about the chambers and the. Now I have to ask how we are for time, because I mean essentially I know how we are for time. We're over time, but I don't know if we go ahead for one more round or if we just have discussions now in the run up to lunch. What do you think, Caroline?
Perhaps you can, if there's one more really pressing question, we could take it, and otherwise perhaps you could.
Moderately pressing. Don't put too much stress on it. Yes.
I think as the keynote you are entitled to to open and close.
I think a challenge in the implementation of the directive could be coming from Belgium and Lithuania, where how to interpret and how to use and measure the national collective agreement on the minimum wage, whether this should become part of the calculation of coverage or not. So whether this becomes a way to address formally the requirement of the directive, while not really maybe addressing the spirit, because if you consider that you have a collective agreement setting the minimum wage, then covering all employees, then you reach 100% and perfect. You have gone well beyond the target set, that is not a target, the reference point set by the Commission. And it's a bit challenging, certainly for us at the OECD, to disentangle what is a collective agreement, what is not, because it is a collective agreement, but it's not really the spirit. So just maybe thinking what you think from a Belgian perspective, and more generally also, Christine, how to think about these issues. So one way for some countries could be to say, okay, but we define the national minimum wage through collective agreement, and we have solved the problem.
I see that my colleague Sam really wants to intervene. So.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but I will just like compliment a little bit, because I think that you touch upon a correct point. We are now at a momentum where there's a spirit of doing something with collective bargaining, with social dialogue, to work on these issues, to have an economic, social story after austerity. But we risk that at some point it just becomes a dead letter and it just becomes a formality, and you declare your national minimum wage indeed as covering 100% of employment, and that's it. So, on the one hand, how to now pick this moment and make most use of it. Secondly, in terms of measurement, we should actually measure to what extent effective wages are governed or are controlled by collective dialogue. So our measure for coverage should actually be a measure of conventional wage coverage rather than how many heads of the population has to some degree a collective agreement that affects some working hours or maybe the very lowest bit of their salary. Like, to what extent, how important is collective bargaining? So I think that could go further on your remark, and maybe it's some food for thought.
Perfect. Thank you both very much for those comments. Indeed, but that would be much more difficult to measure, I think. So I invite the panelists to say a concluding statement, and then we will break for lunch. Now, Rudy, you can start, and then we'll go Christine, and then Eva. And thank you all very much.
Well, thanks to the colleagues from the OECD. You have done a great job in the last 5-6 years on collective bargaining in cooperation with the ILO. I have always appreciated this. The question is indeed one of the questions we are discussing right now. We have already a joint opinion, a first joint opinion on how we will implement the directive. It's social partners wants to keep it as much as possible in their own hands. That's clear. For the public sector, it's a bit more complicated because there it's another system. It's like the ILO system on collective bargaining. The public sector is a separate ILO standard even. So we have this approach. But for the private sector, these are the issues we are discussing. How to measure the coverage, what will we measure, Is it also real wages? Is it minimum wage? So that's an issue we are for the moment discussing. And the Commission has just published its expertise report 2 days ago. We were waiting for that in order to see how we have to interpret the directive. But it's certainly an issue for the future. We will have to intensify our cooperation with the Office of the Planning Bureau, probably the Ministry of Labour, the Federal Ministry of Labour, our colleagues in the same house, the Central Economic Council, and the Social Security system in order to intensify the knowledge, and then of course with the academic world. So indeed, but I think that Belgium is the only country, maybe you make a mistake here, where you can have a national collective agreement that is applicable to all. Yeah, but it's not the same. It's not the same. Because in the real world, the people that sign the agreement, in fact, because of their signature, have already coverage. So the erga omnes is only adding a few elements, because there is so high membership of the employees' organizations. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Christine, could I ask you to intervene one more time? Thank you so much.
Yeah. The question on what counts towards the 80% collective bargaining coverage, and I agree with you, Andrea. You don't have an easy job on this one to find out what is a collective agreement and all these political discussions. I cannot comment on the individual cases, obviously. What our project has shown very much so is that we really have to have a deep dive into the collective agreements and look, do they regulate wages at all? So, because in theory, we found countries with relatively large number of collective agreements that would you know, in the current definition also count towards the 80% collective bargaining coverage, but which do not set pay at all, or in a very rudimentary way, if at all. So if we're talking about wage coverage, I found Sam's intervention very interesting, that we shouldn't just do a head count or a collective agreement count, but really see to what extent the wages in collective agreements are then visible in the wage distribution in workers' actual wages. So that might be an interesting measure for that. But I suppose you will have to discuss further with the member states what counts towards the 80% and what doesn't. Very interesting times ahead of us.
Thank you very much also for joining us remotely. That's really highly appreciated. Eva, could I ask you for a final thought?
I'm just gonna echo what I said at the very start, and what was also becoming very clear from the discussion and the interventions here. That is that we live in exciting times, in the sense that now we have that minimum wage directive, and we're very keen to find out how this is gonna play out. Because I see that there's colleagues, especially legal scholars, who are very skeptical, at least some of them. First they had a big fight over whether there was actually a legal ground for something like the minimum wage in the European, in the whole European construction, but now some are having big doubts whether it's going to have a real bite. So it's very interesting to see how this is gonna play out, also in kind of the wider context of what is happening in the world. We talk at the start. Andrea showed the trends in union density. Union density is by and large on the decline. And now that we have this initiative and why it is declining, we were still for the most part at a loss of what are the driving factors there. So yeah, let's celebrate this big revival in our research into these matters.
Perfect. That's a nice optimistic note to end. And indeed, let's see what comes from it. And thank you very much, Sam, also for putting this project together. And thanks very much to all three panelists for their invaluable contributions to it. And now I suggest we stop. Thank you, Christine.
And thank you also, Wouter, for moderating. maybe just one more note before we all go down for lunch. At the very back, we had an amazing artist working with us today, and we will show you the results of his contribution. So.
So yes, as you're getting ready for your lunch, I'll quickly, very quickly, run through some of the visual summaries I created. We heard from at the start from Andrea, who shared many points in his keynote speech. Here, I'm not going to say anything. I will just jump from slide to slide. I don't want to keep you from your lunch. And then next up, we heard from Sam, who shared this really interesting bargaining simulation game. And then we heard from the several EU member states on their insights from their country cases. We heard from Ireland, Belgium, Croatia, from Finland, Lithuania, and Spain. And of course, finally, the very wide discussion on how we can strengthen collective bargaining systems. So thank you very much and enjoy your lunch.